Back in 2005, I was in a band that toured the country in a 15-passenger van with a trailer. We were on our way from Columbus, Ohio to Erie. The show had been cancelled in Ohio due to a power outage, so we decided to get on the road early, as we had a friend in Erie who was taking us in for the night. While on the I-80 about 25 minutes outside of Erie, I'll never forget this moment for the rest of my life. We were all pretty much alert and actively having a conversation. There were 8 of us in total in the van, when the driver and passenger both shouted simultaneously, "What the hell is that?" I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it. I was sitting with my back against the window and I didn't see anything, but we heard a whooshing noise as if something flew over the van. My friend who was sitting next to me looked like he'd just seen a ghost. We wound up pulling over on the side of the road because everyone was freaking out, thinking we hit something, but nothing was found. Both the passenger and the driver said they saw a tall black figure lunge at the van from the shoulder of the left lane. My friend who was sitting next to me said the same thing. No, I don't think they're all playing a hoax on the unknowing members, because I know these guys and they were scared out their minds. We arrived at our destination, and the house that we were staying at's power was also out. The next day, we inspected the van in daylight and noticed there were streak marks across the roof of the van. Our van was white and also very dirty due to touring the entire country. Still to this day, we don't know what we witnessed. We've done some search on it and similar reports have happened in and around the same area. I was reading the book The Mothman Prophecies around the time of the tour as well, and I'm quite convinced that we had an encounter with the unexplained. It has taken me some time to figure out where to start with this story, since there are so many starting places and no end in sight, at least one I can see. So I've decided to start it at the moment that my life changed forever. Not the drastic change that would come later, but a change that began a terrifying journey that has yet to conclude. I was born in the early 80s. My parents were youth pastors for a Pentecostal church in the southwest of the US. I had grown up in the Pentecostal church my whole life. Eventually, my parents became pastors of their own church. The start of my story isn't the beginning, but it is a start. I'm going to tell you it as I experienced it, so there will be back and forth from one timeline to another, but I want you to take the same journey I did. I was a preteen when I saw it. I'm not sure about the exact year, but I know it must have been between 95 and 97. It was summer. I was at church camp, the same one I had gone to for most of my childhood. It was in the South US, in the hill country area. It was a pretty large camp, really spread out, and on any given summer, there would be roughly 1,000 campers, including adults who either were counselors, helpers, or those doing the church services. My parents were pretty active with camp. In fact, my dad was well known in the district. When people found out I was his son, they were amazed, and sometimes treated me like I was first kid or something. I hate saying this, but I would use this to my advantage sometimes. I would get my way with a lot of things or go behind the scenes of the camp, or any other church activity that others wouldn't. So my parents were there the summer I saw it. I was a camper that year. The building where all the campers stayed at was on top of a hill in a large building. It had only been built just a few years prior. The camp was a lot older, but they had added new buildings and such, and after a huge fire at the old cafeteria, which I have a vague memory of, they built an entirely new cafeteria. The building was in 3 parts. The left side held the boys' dormitories, and the right the girls. The middle was where the small little church sat. This is where I saw it. The little church had light pink carpeted floors, off-pink walls, and cushioned chairs to match. The kid's preacher was a close friend of my dad's, so I knew him pretty well, and vice versa. The stage in front of the room, which was literally a step up from the floor, had a stained glass window in the back. I will never forget this stained glass window for as long as I live, and you're about to find out why. It was a picture of a woman in biblical clothes pouring water from a clay jar into a flowing river. For what? I have no idea. Next to her was a small lamb. They stood on a grassy hill with a tree to the left. I believe there was also a greying sky. I had seen it many times before and admired it greatly. The room was packed full of kids, all of us ranging from ages 12 to 15. Both boys and girls. Boys sat on the left side, girls on the right. There were at least 40 to 50 kids in here. Each of us had itineraries, so while we were in service for an hour, other campers may be doing recreational activities or swimming or any number of things. My bunk, which consisted of about 5 or 6 of us boys, most of whom were from my church. Being who I was, I usually got to pick who I wanted to bunk with, another perk of being my father's son. As service began, my attention span started wavering. I had heard all this religious stuff before from my dad and others. I began looking at the stained glassed window, and that was when I saw it. It had never been there before, at least that I had seen. In the lower right-hand corner, near the red stained glass border, was a face. Not just any face, but a terrifying face. Aside from everything else on the stained glass window, it looked absolutely real, like it was peering through the glass. But this was impossible because behind it was a small area, which held lights to backlight it. No room for anyone big or small. Its skin was fleshy colored, nothing out the ordinary. But what really grabbed my attention wasn't its open mouth with sharp, pointy teeth, but its eyes. The eyes were large, bulging out the sockets. Those eyes have haunted me to this day. On its forehead were 2 small bumps, like a pair of horns that hadn't quite come out yet. It was scary, but I was more fascinated that I had never noticed it before. I leaned over to one of my friends sitting next to me and asked if he had ever noticed that face in the stained glass window. He looked but told me he couldn't see anything. Confused, I asked another friend who replied with the same answer. It was then I began to wonder if I was the only one who could see it, or was it some optical illusion? The whole time we were in there, I couldn't take my eyes off it, and when I tried, I felt like it was staring back at me. As we were leaving the room, I walked to the other side to the area the girls sat and looked. There it was, as it was before, the demonic face. In fact, no matter where I was in the room, the face was there. I pushed it to the back and spent the rest of the day trying not to think about it, until the next day when we went back to church, and it was still there. Same position, same terrifying face, and no one could see it but me. This was when I started to get really scared. Later that day, I had tracked down my dad and asked if I could speak to him in private. We had gone into my parents' cabin. My mother was off somewhere in camp doing God only knows what, and I asked my dad if he knew anything about the stained glass window in the little church. He told me he knew enough. He even knew the guy who had made it, and that it cost the district quite a pretty penny. I asked him if there was a demonic face in it, to which he replied, not that he could remember. He asked me why, and I told him that I kept seeing a demonic face and no one else could. My dad got on his knees, put his hands on my shoulder and told me not to tell anyone about what I was seeing. I tried to protest, but what I had taken as anger back then was actually fear. What kind of fear, I wouldn't learn until much later. Like I said, I thought it was anger that a man of my dad's status had a son who was seeing demons in the Pentecostal religion. It wouldn't be perceived well. I never mentioned it again to my dad or anyone else, but every day I saw it. The whole week, its bulging eyes looked at me. I didn't know it at the time, but seeing this demonic face was just the start of what was to come. It was the beginning of my journey, but not my parents' journey. After camp, we had gotten back home, and my parents had hired some youth pastors from out of state, a husband and wife with 3 kids, 2 girls and the youngest a boy. I don't remember too much about the whole family, just a few snippets here and there. I do, however, remember the young boy, only because he didn't look right. Aside from looking like a typical 6-year-old, he was always pale, with dark circles around his eyes, like he was a ghost. Which I'm not saying he was, because obviously he wasn't. On top of that, the boy was always sick. There was always something wrong with him. For the first few months of them being our youth pastors, they had moved into our house temporarily, until they could find their own home. They lived in my bedroom, which was upstairs and to the right. I was put in the second living room downstairs, which had a TV and a very comfortable sectional couch. The mother homeschooled her kids, but never at home. She always took them someplace else. I believe it was a park or something. So while my dad and the youth pastor were at the church doing their godly work, and my brother and I were at school, my mother had the house to herself. She would tell me that she would hear strange things in the house, and it always came from my bedroom. There were times she would hear someone stomping in my room, or she would hear voices, or something sounded like it had fallen. But each time she would investigate, there would be nothing. In fact, this happened just about every time my mother was home alone, and it had never happened until these people had come to stay with us. Eventually they got a home of their own, but things didn't really change in the house paranormal-wise. My mother would still hear things coming from my bedroom. There was one incident where my Mima, my mother's mother, had come to stay with us for a week, and her and my mother saw what looked like someone standing outside the window in my parents' bedroom. They had even called the police and found nothing, except for the footprints found outside the window. We had lived in a nice neighborhood at the time, but the cops had told my mother that there were always peeping Toms. The only thing I personally experienced in that house was when I had been sleeping in the downstairs living room, while the youth pastor lived with us and I was watching TV in my parents' bedroom. I even remembered which movie I was watching, because like the demonic face, this has haunted me ever since. I was watching Batman Forever, which at that age was my favorite movie, and I had seen it hundreds of times. I had been sitting on the floor, leaning up against my parents' large bed. The bedroom light was off to give more of a theater experience, which I do to this day, and must say I had both of my hands on the ground. My left hand was somewhat under the bed. I was fully immersed in the film, when all of a sudden, I felt a hand touch mine. It came from under the bed. I knew it was a hand. I could feel the flesh of it. I bolted up and ran into the living room to where my parents were, terrified. I told my mother, and she became worried, and my father held his position as a strong man of God and went to investigate. He had looked under the bed, checked the closets, the adjoining bathroom, and of course, found nothing. To make a long story short, after a few months they had moved out of our house, my dad had gone to church one Sunday morning. He would always go around 4 a.m. to pray, set up his sermon and stuff. And when he got into the parking lot, he had seen that the youth pastor's car was in the big, empty parking space, as well as another car. One he recognized, but he wasn't sure whose it was exactly. When he entered the church, he came to find out the youth pastor was with a member of the youth group in his office, having an affair. So eventually my father had to fire him, which caused quite a conflict with people in the church, especially the ones who supported the youth pastor, who happened to be related to the girl he was having an affair with. One woman in particular, Karen, a Hispanic woman who had grown up in Mexico, where we had lived not too far from, just a few miles from the border. The reason I told you this part of the story is because it has a lot to do with the next. After the youth pastor and his family were let go of our church, we had a little over 100 people and had began a revival. My dad had called on an evangelist friend of his, Bob, who was married with 2 children, both boys roughly younger than me and more close to my brother's age. Bob had begun the revival, which became quite huge. I should let you know that I am no longer a Christian, nor do I believe in the Christian religion, and you will soon find out why. Anyway, this revival became really big. Our church was filled to capacity, and people were speaking in tongues, being slain in spirit, and the like. It had lasted 13 weeks, which, now that I think about it, is quite an interesting number considering things. Karen, who was close to the youth pastor my dad had let go, was giving my parents the cold shoulder and started becoming close with the evangelist Bob and his family. One day during this revival, my mother, who I am very close with, told me something I would never forget. She told me that a woman had come to my father, telling him that her daughter was being possessed by a demon, that my dad had to perform an exorcism to no avail. My dad didn't want me to know this, but my mother told me anyway, and told me to keep it a secret and not to tell him that I knew, or even my brother. One night at revival, as people started showing up and getting ready for service, my mother pointed the demon-possessed woman out to me. She seemed normal, pretty even, nothing creepy about her in the least. My mother, being the good pastor's wife she was, always welcomed people, hugging them, talking to them and whatnot. I watched as my mother went over to the demonically possessed woman and welcomed her in and hugged her. As soon as she did, my mother pulled away as the woman began shaking violently. With a panicked look on my mother's face, she walked over to my father, whispering something in his ear. My dad looked over to the woman. My mother came over and told me to get the children rounded up and take them into the dining quarters, as she and others cleared out the sanctuary. Once everyone was out, the doors were shut behind. My dad and a few of the board members were behind the closed doors, dealing with the demonic-possessed woman. It wouldn't be until a few years later that I found out what had happened behind those closed doors. According to what my father told me, he and the board members began praying over the woman, who was shaking violently and spouting obscenities. The janitor lady, Caroline, was in there, as for what reason I don't know. The woman began screaming as if in pain. My father continued to pray for her. Not too long, the woman began to gag, and at this point the janitor lady ran to grab a bucket and brought it over to her, in which the woman vomited it. My father said what came out of her mouth wasn't normal looking. It was like a blackish blob. His first thought was to take it somewhere to get analyzed, but Caroline flushed it down the toilet before he could do anything. What scared my father the most was the fact that the woman was still possessed and told my dad in a dark voice, "We will meet again." My father doesn't like talking about this, and I've only heard this story a few times, and when I bring it up, my dad pretty much shuts down. There's a part of me that thinks there is more to this story, but he won't say, and the reason is that Caroline never came back to the church. In fact, one day not too long after my dad and I had gone to see a movie, my dad wanted to stop by Caroline's place to check on her and find out why she hadn't come back. When she answered the door, cigarette in mouth, it shocked me. She wouldn't let us in, but told my dad something along the lines of, "Pastor, what I saw that night shook my faith," and we never saw her again. Now back to where the demon-possessed girl told my dad that they would meet again. According to my dad, even my grandparents have confirmed this story. When he was a young boy in the late 60s, my dad had awoken in the middle of the night and saw a shadow person in his room. As my dad stared at it in horror, he said it got bigger and bigger until its head was touching the ceiling. My father eventually found his voice and screamed for my grandparents. That's all I know, except for one more event, an unbelievable one. As I stated, I was born in the early 80s. Not too long after I was born, when my parents were youth pastors at a church in the southwest US, on a Wednesday night at church with around 50 to 80 people in the sanctuary, a group of strange people entered the church. My mother said that there were about 10 or 15 of these people, some of whom were dressed in black leather with spikes, typical 80s punk, or others wore white t-shirts with anti-Christian messages written in black ink. They had gone to the front of the church during service and started disrupting, saying obscenities against Christ and Christians. The pastor and the board members, whom my dad was one of, took all the people outside the church while someone called the cops, who were on their way. I cannot stress enough, this took place in the early 80s. The leader of the group started talking to my dad. He was younger than my dad, and he said he knew my dad and hadn't seen him in a long time. My dad asked what he meant, to which the leader said something along the lines of, "I was in your bedroom that night." To further prove this, he began telling my dad he knew a lot about him, like where he was born, who my grandparents were, his social security number, who his best friend growing up was, his favorite car, teacher, where he went to college, and then the leader gave the same information about my mother. Then, scarily enough, he mentioned my name, my social security number, where I was born, and that I was his marked and watched. Just writing this out gives me chills considering. I recently brought this up, and my mother says that it still scares her to this day. I'd first heard this story when I was 16 or so, and I remember one time at camp, the same one where I saw the demon, where me and my friends were, who were too young to actually be campers. We're heading up to our cabin at the top of a hill, while our parents were doing church camp stuff. It was night. On our way up the hill, we encountered a man who came out of nowhere. He was dressed like a biker, leather and spikes. I don't really remember much, except that the three of us ran down the hill and got scared, where we ran into one of our mothers, who told us to get in the van. She looked around with a flashlight as we drove up the hill but couldn't see anything, and I've always wondered if that man had something to do with these people many years before, who interrupted that church service that said I was theirs. Anyway, back to the revival. After the incident with the demonically possessed girl, things got back to normal, in a sense. On the 13th week of the revival, Bob had approached my father and told him God told him to build another church, so he did. Except he took a lot of members from our church, which hurt our church greatly. We had roughly 200 members, and were now down to less than 50. One of the people who left with Bob was Karen. Karen had come up to my mum and told her that she and her family weren't happy with how things had gone down with the youth pastors. She told my mother that she had come from some dark places in Mexico, and that she gave my family the evil eye, which my mother had no idea what that meant. The next part would devastate me. First, I'm going to tell you how I experienced it, followed by what my parents saw, which they wouldn't tell me until I was an adult, and for good reason. It was Sunday morning, and my mother had awoken me to get ready for church. I got off bed, sleepily, and started to get dressed when I noticed that my dog, Pepper, had pooed on my floor. Pepper was my dog. She loved me, and when I left for school, she would sit at the window and wait for me. wouldn't even eat until I arrived back. Panicked, because my mother would get very upset when Pepper would use the restroom on our carpet, I ran into the adjoining bathroom, grabbed a white towel that I would do laundry with later, and hopefully my mother would never find, ran over to the spot and noticed that the diarrhea was even worse. I put the towel atop and started to wipe. And that's when I noticed it wasn't diarrhea at all. It was a pool of blood. I looked over at Pepper, and she was laying next to my bed. I figured she was sick. I ran and told my mum, and I thought she would be upset, but I saw worry and terror in her face. She told me to put Pepper outside with food and water, and we would let her back in once we got back from church. Once church ended, we got home. I ran out of the car to the backyard. No joke when I say this. I found my dog lying on her side near the house. I called to her. Nothing. I figured she was in deep sleep. I walked over and put my hand on her to let her know I was home, and she was stiff as a board. Tears welling in my eyes, I backed away slowly and ran inside to tell my parents. Strangely, when I saw them, my mother had tears in her eyes already and was scared. My dad's face, blank. I told them about Pepper, and that afternoon before church we took Pepper's tiny body and buried her outside in the churchyard, far away from the church itself. It was hard watching my dad dig the hole and place Pepper, now wrapped in a black trash bag, into the ground. I would descend into depression after this. Like I said, it wasn't until about 18 or 19 when my parents told me the truth. You see, when we got home from church that dreadful Sunday afternoon as I ran to the backyard, my parents found their door slightly open. Upon going inside, my parents were startled to find every picture my mother had hanging on the walls upside down. Pictures on tables and as such were face down. On the kitchen counter was a long, thick strand of hair, which my dad had analyzed at the nearby police station, which revealed that it was horse hair. Someone had broken into our house. Even worse, someone had poisoned my dog. My mother said that Karen had threatened my parents with witchcraft a few days before, saying that my parents would regret what they had done to the youth pastor. To this day, I don't understand why the youth pastors were so important to Karen. All I know is that woman had something to do with ending the life of my dog and breaking into my house. Upon more investigating, I found out that our family was cursed, and literally ever since, my family has been through hell. I'd never seen the demon face again, but I have had many strange incidences, most of which I can't find any relation to. But I don't think it has left me alone. My husband, yes, I'm gay, has seen shadows ever since we got together. My husband is an atheist and doesn't believe in anything paranormal. But sometimes I think even he thinks there's something strange going on. I feel like I'm being watched, and I hear someone call out my name. One time I was at work and I heard someone call my name. I walked around the store asking co-workers if they'd called me, and they all said no. Thinking it was in my head, I went back to where I had heard it, and my co-workers there asked who had called my name, which meant they heard it too. So much has happened in my life, things I can't even begin to put into writing. I know without a shadow of a doubt that whatever I saw is still haunting me in some form. Not a day goes by that I don't think of that demonic face. Not a day goes by that I don't think there is some group of demonically possessed people who know my parents and me, who say I'm theirs. I don't trust a lot of people. I don't know if these people have followed me. Some incidents make me think, perhaps. I can tell you that I live in fear. I don't know how to deal with a lot of this. My husband, who doesn't think I'm lying, thinks a lot of it's in my head, on top of coincidence. I can see why people think that. But trust me when I say this isn't a story that's easy to put into words. It's more something that you have to have experienced to understand. There is so much more to tell. For now, I think this will be enough. If anyone has any idea what is going on or knows something, anything that would help, it would be greatly appreciated. Whatever this entity is still haunting me, and my family, and this curse is getting worse. I'm not lying when I say that I am beyond scared. I used to date a girl in college who lived 3 hours away. We would trade weekends, one at her school, one at mine. One day she got upset because she had driven all the way to see me, and I was in an all-night study session which she had known about and couldn't be home to see her. She texted me that she was going back to her place, and I never heard anything from her again. After 3 days of texting her trying to make sure she was okay, her messages started coming back as number not found. I sent her the stuff she'd left at my apartment in the mail, and it returned as no forwarding address. Her instant messenger account, which I had never messaged but knew the name of, disconnected. And it gets weirder. I called her apartment landline and was told the people who had lived there had moved out. She had 3 roommates and didn't leave a number as to where they went. I got really freaked out and asked friends who worked in school admin to pull some strings, just to make sure she was alive. The school she was at didn't have any record of her as a student. The license plate to her car wasn't registered to anyone. None of our mutual friends ever saw her again, and I called the police, but there were no car accidents involving anyone who fit her description in the stretch of road between our 2 schools that night, or in the 2 weeks that followed. I didn't ask for a longer time frame because at that point she was already missing. Cops wouldn't file a missing person report because I wasn't a family member. To this day I have no idea what happened, why she freaked out on me so bad, or if she's still alive, or in witness protection, or was erased from all time by an evil wizard. She literally vanished without a trace. Firstly, I would like to state that I am an atheist and tend to remain skeptical when it comes to the supernatural or paranormal. But there have been a handful of events that have occurred in my life that science or rational thoughts can't explain. One such moment occurred in July of this year. For context, I am a 23-year-old man, originally from the north of England, but now I'm currently living in the West Midlands. During the events of this experience, I was house sitting with my boyfriend. They had quite a large amount of land and were in the middle of nowhere. And by nowhere, I mean in the middle of a forest, on top of a hill, surrounded by peaks and caves. Our friend and her husband had gone on holiday, but due to having quite a lot of land and a very large and ostentatious home and a lot of animals to look after, we were invited to house sit. I didn't mind though, as I already live in the countryside, and because of my boyfriend's work I usually am home alone, so I don't mind the isolation much. I imagined it would be fun to explore the woods, play with the animals on the farm, and even go explore the caves nearby, as they were full of ruins and cave houses that were built during the Bronze Age or something. We were staying in the guest house and were tasked with making sure the gardens were looked after, the yards were kept clean, and the house itself was secure, and that the 6 horses, 5 geese, and 2 farm cats were all looked after. Despite it being a lot of work cleaning up after the horses and just generally looking after the place, we were enjoying ourselves, taking time to swim in the pool and binge watching Netflix. However, my boyfriend has recently been promoted and was unfortunately called into work for the last few days of the week. He tried to make sure that he helped me with all the jobs before he left in the afternoon, But on Friday, I had to do the afternoon chores all by myself. So after feeding horses, I put the geese back into their shed, making sure they had water and food, when I noticed the two farm cats acting very strange. Harry and Jack, despite being tough farm cats, had the nicest disposition ever. They were really friendly, but now they were stood by one of the biggest gates on the yard, hissing at the bolted and locked wooden gate. Then suddenly they stopped hissing and climbed back into their little wooden house, seemingly for the night. After locking the geese in their hut and making sure it was secured against the local fox, I went over to the big yard gate. I tried to peep through this massive, barbed wire gate to see if there was anyone outside, and there was nothing there. In truth, I didn't expect to see anyone, because the house itself was in the middle of the forest and hills. Pretty much, I was in the middle of nowhere, and the nearest village was a 20-minute drive away. I just chalked the cat's odd behavior up to a naughty fox trying to sneak in, but I couldn't help but feel a little on edge. After giving the cats food and water, I locked them in their cool little cat house, just to make sure they wouldn't be brawling with the local fox or other wildlife. Once I did that, I did one last check of the horses in the fields, so I hiked up the hill, and whilst checking on the two mares, I got this odd sensation like someone was watching me. I would have chalked it up to paranoia, but suddenly the two mares let out shrill cries and bolted. I felt both confused and worried, as the normally very placid mares rushed out of the field and hid inside their shelter. If that wasn't weird enough, things only grew more troubling. When I made my way back down through the fields, I discovered all the horses were doing the same. The big, boisterous stallion Saxon was hiding within his field shelter, and the little family, a trio of horses comprised of a mare foal and male horse, had also taken a hiding in their shelter at the far end of their field. This was really weird. I had spent every hour of the day for a week observing these animals and looking after them. They'd never acted like this before. I even considered calling my boyfriend back, but couldn't help but feeling like I was overreacting. As I finished tidying the yard, I switched on the electric fences and made my way back to the guest house. It was getting cold, and it was somewhat soothing. We had experienced a week of scorching weather, so a little breeze and shade was actually quite relaxing. But the breeze turned to a gale, and grey clouds grew above me and went black in an instant. And I remember feeling really uneasy as I looked up at the suddenly tempestuous skies. The heavens then unleashed, and I rushed off down the garden path back to the guest house, which was situated next to the electronic gate and just across from the main house. I suddenly felt a lot safer, and then I thought to myself, safer? Safe from what? I had no idea why I was freaking out so much. I told myself to stop being stupid and kept telling myself people of my age shouldn't get worked up over nothing. So I opened the guest house door and proceeded to tidy up the wheelbarrows away and lock up the garage, which was handily connected to the side of the guest house, with its roof sheltering me from the rain. Then a rather nasty wind whipped down through the path leading up to the garden, startling not just me, but all the birds who were nesting in the bushes at the time. Their unexpected and frantic screeching was enough for me. I slammed the garage door shut, locking it quickly, and scrambled back into the guest house. Now, all the time we had been staying there, we had never locked the door to the guest house. I guess we felt safe behind the high walls and electronic gates. I see now that we were foolish to think so. Yet something about tonight made me want to lock that door. Perhaps it was because of the weather, or the strange behavior of the animals. Or maybe it was the notion that my boyfriend, the only person who knew I was out there and who could help me, wouldn't be back until 3 in the morning. Regardless, something about tonight made me feel like the simple wooden door and its easily smashable glass windows were all the protection I had. So I locked the door from the inside and kept the keys in my pocket. Sitting down on the sofa, I turned on the television and began to watch my favorite soap opera to take my mind off my irrational fears. However, every now and again my eyes would veer away from the television and gaze out of the 3 very large windows, looking out across the gravelly front yard and the distant rain-drenched garden. I didn't know why I kept looking out of the windows, but in hindsight, I think it was my instincts telling me to do so, to keep a watch because something was coming. Evening turned to night, and I let out a tired yawn as I watched as the lights around the yard automatically came on. I looked out past the kitchen and out the glass on the door to see the patio light turn on, just as it had always done. I know it seems silly, but the idea of being surrounded by light made me feel safe. Nothing can hide in the light, and it seemed like the light was able to banish all bad things, all the bogeymen in closets, or the monsters under the bed. It could even get rid of nightmares. And now, I was safe, surrounded by my lights. How stupid was I? A loud knock rapped upon the guest house door, almost causing me to jump out of my skin. I looked over to the door, but the patio light had gone out and made it difficult to see anything. Feeling rather frightened, I turned the television off and looked out the living room window to check that the electronic gates were still shut, which they were. I kept thinking maybe my imagination had gotten the better of me, and that my fear had just made me believe I had heard the knock at the door. However, any doubt I had was washed away as a second, more firm knock rattled across the glass on the door. Utter disbelief took hold, and I could feel myself leave my body. That's how shocked I was. I mean, this isn't a street in the middle of an estate. This was the middle of nowhere. For a moment, I sat there listening to the rain drumming on the window of the guest house, and with a deep breath, I stood up, stepping towards the kitchen and the front door. To my shock and surprise, on the other side of the glass on the door were 2 young boys. They looked to be about 12 to 14, and the dark hoodies that they wore were sodden from the rain, as if they had been standing out there the entire night. They looked cold and pale, and a surge of humanity and compassion swept over me, causing me to almost commit a massive mistake. I rushed over to the door and went to open it, fearing that the children may be injured or lost. But then, it suddenly dawned on me. Where did they come from? How did they get in without me opening the electronic gates? I slowly withdrew my hand from the opening, and the 2 boys looked up towards me from behind the glass, their face still shrouded behind their hoods. "Please let us in. We went for a walk and got lost in the woods," the taller and more mature of the 2 boys spoke. His words seemed more calculating and smooth than that of a child. "We're lost and cold," the small boy whimpered. His words pulled on my heartstrings, and I did feel really worried for them. But then, I once again reminded myself this wasn't possible, so I summed up all my courage and all my breath and asked the two children a question. Where did you come from? How did you get in here? The gate was open. We saw the lights were on and rushed over. Please, can we come in out the cold? We just want to call our parents. They'll be worried sick, the taller boy exclaimed, with his well-composed words luring me towards the door. Again, I found myself believing the words of the more mature boy, and I almost believed his explanation before I suddenly realized the gates had been closed since my boyfriend had left. Only we were in possession of the remotes used to open them, and I knew they hadn't opened. You're lying. The gate's been shut all night. I never even saw you come in. So where did you come from? The two young boys looked at each other, and then what happened next sent shivers down my spine. They turned their heads to look behind them, and there, down the garden path, was an even taller boy, emerging from the darkness. His long, slender form seemed to drift through the bushes and trees that hung over the little pathway. Like the others, he was wearing a dark hoodie, and his spindly hands were cold, white. What little I could see of his face looked just like the two smaller boys, pale and ghostly. I shuddered, and the whole kitchen went cold. I could literally see my breath, and I felt more terror from these three young boys than I've ever felt before from anything else. I know it seems crazy, but there was something about their voices and their near identical clothing. It just wasn't normal. It was like they were trying to appear as normal and human as they could, but lacked the sense of identity and uniqueness that all humans have. As the older boy approached, I realized he was as tall as me and stood between the two haunting children. I stepped back. Please let us in. It's cold and dark, and we're frightened, the taller boy said. Weirdly, his voice still sounded young and partially childlike, but it didn't seem normal. I stepped back a little further. Come on, Connor. Let us in. We can't come in unless you say it's okay. The older and more dominating of the three boys called out. My eyes widened with disbelief. I felt my whole body shiver with fear, and my heart threatened to stop as I let out a gasp. How could they know my name? That's impossible. This sort of stuff doesn't happen in real life, and hoping that this was all some sort of hallucination or my imagination gone wild, I closed my eyes for a moment and hoped that when I opened them again, they would be gone. But when I did, they were still there. Get out of here, I'm gonna call the police, I yelled, with my words not carrying any sort of strength. They wouldn't get here in time. You're in the middle of nowhere. You're all alone with us. The two small boys giggled. Their hideous giggling and heinous laughter sent fear rocketing through me. I could feel my eyes filling with tears, and terror consumed me. They kept laughing, and they kept cackling and giggling. Their teeth were as black as charcoal. Go away. Leave me alone, I cried out. But the boys suddenly stopped laughing and pushed their faces up against the glass on the door. Their eyes were black. I couldn't even scream. I couldn't move, and I now knew these three phantoms were not children. Whatever these creatures were, with their eyes like midnight and their festering grins, they were not human. And worse than that, They were thoroughly enjoying terrorizing me. "You're going to die in there," the smaller boy giggled. At that, I let out a yell and ran into the living room. I slammed the kitchen door shut and pushed one of the living room chairs up against it. I kept fearing that the simple wooden door would not keep them out, and staggered back towards the bedroom. But I could still hear them giggling and taunting me. I could feel my heart thumping, and the sense of fight or flight was taking hold. But I couldn't fight whatever those things were, and I couldn't run away either. Where would I go if I somehow escaped into the woods? I dreaded to think what else could be lurking out there. But what if I managed to get to the horse fields? Would I be safe with them? I doubted it. And what if I was outside, and there were more than just 3? As I wrestled with my chances and choices, I suddenly realized I couldn't hear them anymore. My eyes caught a glance of something pale, and I saw them, standing on the other side of the living room windows. Each of the 3 children was stood in front of one of the 3 large windows, grinning at me. I wanted to run over and shut the blinds, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. And when I finally felt movement return to me, I ran for the bathroom, the only room in the guest house with a lock. I locked myself inside and sat in the shower with the lights off, hoping they would just leave. As I laid there, praying to every god, angel, demon, and deity I could think of, but none of them answered my call. It was like the boy said, I was alone. For hours I stayed there listening to the boys as they continued to yell, "Let us in, let us in." It seemed like it would never end, until it suddenly and abruptly did. I couldn't hear them anymore, and after half an hour of silence, I summoned up what courage I had left and peeked out of the bathroom. The boys were gone from the living room window, so seeing my chance, I ran over and shut the blinds. Then I wondered if they were back at the front door. So again I took a deep breath and pushed the chair aside and opened the kitchen door. They weren't there anymore, and the patio light was on again. They were gone. However, I took no relief from their disappearance, for even though I knew they were gone physically, I couldn't help but feel as though they were still lurking somewhere down in the garden path, watching me from the shadows, waiting for me to let my guard down and jump out to begin the terrorism anew. For the rest of the night I sat up, with all the lights on and a big kitchen knife in my hand, waiting for my boyfriend to come back. When morning came, I heard the gates open. My eyes were heavy, and I was exhausted, but that sound filled me with a wave of energy. I rushed over to the front door, unlocking it, and sprinted over to him. In a frantic ramble, I tried to tell him what had happened, and despite him saying he believed me, I couldn't see he did. Why would he? I was on edge for the rest of my time there. I couldn't sleep properly, and every time we were back on the fields or in the garden, I could sense their eyes on me. The following day, nothing happened, and the owners returned. I wanted to tell them what I had experienced, as they are good friends of ours, but didn't want to freak them out or sound crazy, so I kept it to myself. As we had breakfast with them, one of the owners, Steph, told us how much of a good job we'd done and asked if we'd enjoyed it, which I replied with a reluctant yes. Her mood changed, and her eyes looked worried as she asked if there were any problems. I assumed by problems she meant with the animals, and when I told her the animals were all great, she looked at me and asked if anyone tried to break in. I could feel what she was about to say before she even said it, and I knew I didn't want to hear it. I would prefer my experience with those boys to just be a hallucination or the onset of madness, but I knew from the look in her eyes that she was going to tell us otherwise. Steph said the last few times they went on holiday, they would come home and find footage on their CCTV of 3 boys knocking at the door late at night and calling for someone to be let in. They had the police search the grounds and the surrounding area, but there were no signs of a break-in. In truth, there were no signs that the boys even existed. I told her about my experience, and she seemed genuinely unnerved. And my boyfriend, who is as skeptical as they come, apologized for not believing me. They asked if we would ever house sit for them again, and I, without hesitation, said no. I never want to cross paths with those strange boys in their midnight eyes. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if it had not been me in the guest house, but someone more trusting. I wonder what might have happened had I let them in. I imagine I would not be here to write this account had I done so. I don't know who or what they are, or where they came from. All I know is that they weren't normal. They're real, and I will never forget my visitation from the black-eyed children. As much as I do believe in the paranormal, I don't usually get the opportunity to experience it firsthand. I want to start off by saying that being from Hawaii, there are many superstitions that I still follow to this day, in respecting my ancestors and understanding my culture. I work in the film industry, and sometimes where we shoot tends to be in certain sacred locations back in the old Hawaiian days. For example, if it was just me on a hiking trip, I would have done to chant an oli to grant me safe passage. However, this job pretty much disregards those types of locations if it's considered a tourist area. We were filming at Waimea Falls, which has a rich history of the paranormal, located on the island of Oahu. As the day was wrapping up, I found out one of the crew members left some equipment back at the falls, and I volunteered on retrieving it. It was completely dark, and it was about a 10-minute drive via a quad to trek up the narrow path towards the falls. I had a colleague help me in locating it in the forest to no avail. I kept feeling eyes were watching us, and we shouldn't linger any longer. We decided to leave and got back on the four-wheeler to head back to base camp. As my colleague was trying to fix the gear, the headlights were beaming our exit. I glanced over to see a shadowy figure standing in the middle of our path. Thinking in my head, that's not right. I looked away, hoping it was only an illusion of some kind. I blinked, hoping I wasn't crazy, and I turned to see if the figure was still there. To my horror, the shadow figure stood 10 feet away from me, blocking our path in front of the headlights. Mind you, these lights were on high beam, illuminating the front road, and all the darkness tucked far back except for the figure. Trying not to cause any alarm to my colleague who didn't want to notice the figure, I quickly closed my eyes shut and told him to hurry up and drive. He asked what was wrong, but I didn't budge until we were back in our well-lit environment. I felt ashamed for causing a disturbance even though it was unintentional. I sent a prayer before my departure and hoped the being could remain at peace. But that experience was a shocker for the first time. Thankfully, it didn't follow me home. This incident happened last year in 2019. Unfortunately, I don't have any proof for the fact that I was completely chicken under those circumstances. Mahalo nui loa for reading this story. And please do not piss off any ghosts on your excursions, people. I live in a somewhat medium-sized town, with a mix of cities and backwoods areas nearby. The bus stop I use has a good mix. It has buildings nearby, while also having entry to the nearby surrounding woods. One morning I was waiting in the bus, when I realized it was late that morning. I got annoyed and decided since I was bored, I would go into this little walkway/trail that was nearby. Not all the way, just enough to where I could be secluded by the trees. After a while of checking my phone, I heard the bus stop. At the stop, a little way down from mine. I headed back to the stop, and when I got there, I got a fight or flight response that was very intense, like if a weapon had just been shot off. I turned around to see this crouching creature coming out of the secluded area. It was just pitch black, arms about the size of half its body. Its head looked like an eraser. The most terrifying part of it was the creature's size. It was easily the size of a telephone or lamp pole. It towered over me and everything around it. Its hands were large and its fingers were thick and were about the size of half my arm. I don't know if I should run because I knew this thing would catch me in a matter of steps. Some time passed while it climbed out of the walkway and stood looking at me. Then the bus pulled up and opened its doors. I looked at the bus and back at the creature, but it was gone, just vanished. I looked at the bus driver and his face was normal, so I assumed he hadn't seen anything. I got on the bus and silently cried for a few minutes. I don't know if this is correlated or if just my brain, but that night I had a dream where the exact same thing happened, except the bus didn't show up, and as you can imagine, things didn't go all that well for me for the rest of the dream. My friends called it the Line Man, but I don't care about naming it. I've been back to the bus stop over the course of a week, and every time I was watching the trees in the walkway, but never saw it. I'm still scared of going back to that bus stop. I've never actually told anyone about this, but when I was 11 and my siblings were in my room playing Halo, we had 2 controllers, so we're taking turns, and I was just watching my brother and sister play. My room had a bathroom connected to my sister's room that always paranoid me, so I left the door closed and locked. I noticed that the door was open and went to close it thinking my brother may have opened it. And then it was my turn, so I started playing. When I finished, I noticed that the door was open again. I told my brother very adamantly, "Keep this door closed, stop opening it." He and my 2 other siblings claimed they didn't open it. I closed it again and sat on my bed staring at it, seeing why it was opening. All of a sudden the door slams open and I see some cloudy shadow that looks like a person of about 5'8" move into the bathroom. I didn't say anything and just bolted out of the room into the living room. I refused to go back into the room for about 2 months and slept on the couch every night. As I said, I never told anyone about this, but I assume my mum sort of knew what had happened, because about a year ago my mum was telling me stuff she saw in the house and never mentioned it because she didn't want to scare us. My dad also had a similar experience in that house, like seeing someone lean over him when he woke up at night. That was the only experience I had there, and now I'm a bit of a skeptical on the paranormal and think perhaps it may have been my imagination, or maybe airdrafts opening the door, but I guess I'll never know. Last night, I was playing video games at 1:30 in the morning when I noticed that my dog started scratching at the door to get in. They usually do that when the temperature isn't right. We live in Mexico, by the way. And I went to open the door, but when I did, they ran scared into my room. The 3 of them were shaking and hiding under the bed. It was so unexpected because they'd never done that, and I was really freaking out because I knew for a fact that something had scared them. We have a gym in our house, but it's in a room that isn't connected to the house itself. Even before going into the gym, I noticed something strange because the door was open, and we never leave the door open so the dogs can't get in. I also noticed that the gym light was turned off, so my first assumption was that someone was breaking into the house, but I wanted to check. When I opened the gym door, I saw something that still gives me chills. I saw red eyes in the back of the gym, and an enormous, dark silhouette that was even noticeable. in the absolute darkness. It was very tall, and I felt like evil incarnate was right there in front of me. I ran back to the main house, and I swear I heard something running behind me that sounded like horseshoes. I entered my room, locked the door, and heard nothing else that night. The morning I checked, and there was nothing strange in the gym at all. I know it's not a dream, because my dogs are still unable to go anywhere near that door. I don't think I want to use that gym anymore. This happened to my childhood friend, Gene. He was the only son of an immigrant couple. They had him in later years, so he lived a completely sheltered life and had a complete lack of social skills and social development. They had no other family around, only friends, mostly other immigrants from the same country. Gene's father was very well off, but he lived like a miser. So Gene grew up thinking they were middle class bordering on poor. When Gene was in his 30s, his father passed away from an illness. Shortly after that, his mother was tragically struck by a vehicle and killed as she crossed a busy street. Gene was left all alone and in charge of a fortune and assets he was ill-prepared to handle. Out of nowhere, a relative from the old country appears. She was young, attractive, and a lady, supposedly a distant cousin. Soon she was seen with Gene here and there, not too often, but often enough that people began to notice. 3 months later, Gene simply vanished. No one knew where he went, why he wasn't around, and now the cousin had control of the fortune. Another friend of the family got concerned and called the local police to report him as a missing person. The guy in charge told the friend to never inquire again about Gene, to better leave this matter alone. No one knows what happened to Gene, but several of us have several guesses. I live on the edge of a forest known as Cannock Chase. A specific area of it is known as Cavern Woods, which has been documented in news for alien sightings, pigman sightings, and was the original black-eyed children sighting spot. So you could say that it's a hotbed of paranormal activity. Since moving there 4 years ago, I have been seeing some kind of entity. This thing stalks the boundaries of the woods, usually black and shadowy, with a skeletal head that resembles a deer skull with antlers, similar looking to the Mort, which is on YouTube, a cryptid TV show. It would seem that it has taken a shine to me, as any time I'm passing the woods, it is there stalking and watching. When I walk my dog will react to it, as sometimes it can be seen just out of the edge of the woods near the fields. Just weird, and wondered if anyone else has seen something like this. Just weird, and wondered if we have anyone who's an expert in sightings on Cannock Chase that could look into this. It seems strange that numerous family members have also noticed some figure stalking them and watching them in the woods, even at times in the brightly lit sections. When I was born, my parents rented a small house until I was roughly 2 years old. The only memorable thing mentioned to me was my mother hearing an elderly woman soothing me when I was sick when she walked into the room. Everything that had been left out had been put away. They believed they caught her on a picture, but I have to dig around and see if I can find it. We moved into the house that my great aunt had found for us. This was around 93. I remember being terrified of being alone anywhere in the house. I remember waking up to voices, having very vivid dreams and seeing shadows. The scariest moment was when I woke up and looked at my window to see what looked like a shadow trying to get in. Now you're thinking, so what? Someone tried to break in. Nothing paranormal about that. True, except my room was on the 3rd floor and the only thing outside my window was a long fall to the ground. For the record, this entity was not the old woman. This thing was different. After that incident, I slept in my parents' room for a few years. I was terrified. Looking back at some of the pictures, you can see an old shadow here and there. We've also had cats our entire lives, and each cat would become very protective of me. My parents figured it was just cat behavior to look after the weakest family member, but it happened until I was much older. When I was 13, we finally moved out of that house into a newly built house. We were, and still are, the first occupants. The first night there, I heard walking in my room, followed by a loud bang that terrified me. I went to my parents and told them that whatever was at the house followed us here. They dismissed it as the house settling, but I knew better. Over the years, things were relatively quiet. I ended up joining a paranormal group and honed in on my sensing abilities, since I had originally shut them off as a child. Upon meeting the members, one of them looked at me and asked if she could talk to me in private. She then accurately described my old house, where my room was, the color and layout of the room, and my experiences. Now, I had yet to tell anyone about these experiences, so I was taken aback a bit. She said she couldn't fully get a look at what it was, but that it was still with me. This reinforced my idea that it didn't want to be found out, and to this day, every time I try and focus in on it, I get a nasty headache and the feeling of being blocked. After a few years of investigating places, we obviously had things attached to us. The good, the bad, and the demonic. The demonic things really took a toll on all of us, but mostly my wonderful future wife. But these are stories for another time. What I want to mention is that whatever they were around me. I got the sense that the things from my childhood had grown a lot stronger, and one of them had become the ringleader. I felt like it would give orders and sit back and watch. Getting back on track about the house, some of the memorable occurrences there have happened to only me. I woke up to my dog whining, which meant she wanted me to put her to bed. I told her to just go ahead and jump because I'm not getting up. I felt something get on the bed. As soon as I felt it, my dog went crazy. She began barking and growling, and my cat started hissing. I assumed that meant that the kitty was on the bed and they were fighting since she hated the dog. It was at that moment that I realized the barking and growling were coming from the door and not the bed. I finally looked, and both animals were staring at whatever was on the end of the bed. When I turned to look, I just saw a black blob. I could faintly make out eyes, and that it was moving its head. I was so tired that I just said, "Look, I'm exhausted from work and not putting up with this. Go away." It left, and that was that. Another day, my mother came home and asked why I messed with her headbands. Now, she had a wall thing where she put her headbands. I walked in there and they were all sticking straight out. Another time I was in the shower and heard the front door open, and someone walked in. I assumed it was my father, since it was around the time he usually arrived home. I got out and heard what sounded like him whistling. No big deal, until I looked outside and saw that my car was the only one in the driveway. As soon as I noticed this, the whistling stopped, and I immediately grabbed 2 knives and checked every room in the house, as I was certain someone broke in. I found nothing, and as soon as I put the knives down, the whistling started again. At that point I bolted, called my dad and said, "Look, it's either a ghost or someone who broke in, so good luck." Since I work night shift, I would come home around 4 or 5 in the morning. I walked in and heard someone say, "Hey." I would respond and get nothing. I've seen a woman in the kitchen who looks like my great aunt. My mother was sick and sleeping downstairs, and when I walked in, a voice whispered, "Shh, she's sleeping." I've had the front door yanked out my hand. I've even seen the deadbolt turn by itself. I've walked in on conversations only to hear, "Shh, he's here. Be quiet." Now those things I can deal with. But whatever followed me from the creepy house pretty much stays in one room. Everyone I have ever brought over has said that the room feels heavy and off. Even my parents don't like being in there for more than a few minutes. I figured out that if you knock before entering, the atmosphere seems lighter. I have since moved out, and the first thing I said before leaving was, "You are not to follow me. I don't care if you stay here, but you aren't coming with me." Interestingly enough, my parents don't experience anything, at least not that they will openly admit. They hear the occasional bump and walking every now and then. But we think that's Kitty, who passed 2 years ago. We had her for nearly 20 years. I'm pretty sure I'm leaving things out. In any case, thanks for listening. I was 19 when this happened. I live in Chicago, Illinois. My family and I used to rent an apartment in the McKinley Park neighborhood. Our tenants were, at the time, family members. My then aunt was 9 months into her pregnancy, and on that day her water broke. There was limited space in the 2 family cars, and the rest of my family went with her to the hospital, which was only a 15-minute drive from their current location. I volunteered to stay back, as I had the house all to myself. It was a 2-story house, 2 separate apartments, and the basement which was fully furnished. The layout is complex to describe, because the winding staircase that leads from the first floor to the basement is located in the first floor's kitchen. At the bottom landing to the right, immediately following the landing, is a laundry room and an adjacent half bathroom. If you follow the corridor leading straight in front of the staircase, there's another room to the right, a bedroom belonging to my, at the time, uncle. Past that, there is a large room, a recreation room, with space for a minibar, a pool table, a set of weights, and a small cot or bed. This is relevant because as soon as my family left for the hospital, I headed downstairs to do some exercise. I went downstairs and I sat by the set of weights, loaded them, and got in position to start bench pressing. I did about 3 sets before it hit the fan. It started off very subtly. I was ripping out a set of bench presses when I heard the unmistakable creak of someone walking down those old winding steps from the staircase that leads from the kitchen on the first floor to the basement. I instinctively called out my sister's name, thinking that she'd come back. Nothing. After listening attentively for a few seconds, I convinced myself that it was just the house settling, and I resumed my exercise. I got halfway through a set when I heard it again. This time, I was sure I wasn't hearing things. I got up and cautiously walked to the landing of the winding staircase, and I made my way up slowly. It creaked beneath my feet. I'm not a big guy, 5'7", and at the time I weighed an underwhelming 150 pounds, but I was, and continue to be, very strong and agile. But I was unnerved a bit. I walked around the entire first floor to make sure I was alone, and no one had returned, or worse, broken in. Before I made my way upstairs to check the first floor, I checked all the rooms in the basement except the bedroom. It was always kept locked, and this time was no exception. As I headed back down from checking the first floor, the door was wide open. Typically, this bedroom had a bed, 2 nightstands, a TV, and a walk-in closet. None of these were there. The room was completely empty, and I felt I was in a trance. In the middle of the room was a familiar little girl. It was my sister. Except this couldn't be her. This girl looked like my sister when she was 11, with long bangs. My sister is older than me by 2 years. She's 21 now. But there she stood in front of me, looking 11. But her eyes had no whites, they were all black. It looked like she was looking right into me, and I got cold chills all over my body. She smiled creepily at me, not menacing, just creepily. I ran out that room and slammed the door shut behind me. I turned off all the lights, ran to the second floor and waited for my family to return from the hospital. When they did, I didn't mention anything to them. My step-grandmother is a witch, not a horrible person, a literal witch. I know she was into the occult, and I never liked being at that house, but that's where I had my weight set. After that, I decided not to go downstairs again. I don't believe in ghosts, ghouls, or phantoms or apparitions in the traditional sense. I know what these beings are. They're demons who take on many forms, and I don't want to be a part of them. Thankfully, we were later able to move out to our own house, and since then, we've been just fine. I live in Mexico. My city is very old. The majority of its inhabitants actually came from out of state or other towns nearby. Now the place is thriving. It is in fact the second largest city in the state, but it wasn't always this way. 50 years ago, from my mother's recollection, there weren't many houses there besides theirs, and they said that children at the time preferred not to go out at night because things were said to happen. When I was little, I remember that I woke up once in the middle of the night to pee, to an outhouse that was a short distance away. After doing what I needed to do, I shook my head and at that very moment saw a creature, like a big cat. It was dark, solitary, and it alarmed me, as I'd never seen something like that before or since. I got very scared. The scary thing was that my aunt once told me one of her personal experiences of a neighbor who passed away when she saw one of these large cats that transformed after it followed her into the house. You see, this story was given more credit, as in Mexico we believe in the Nawa, which is a witch that it can allegedly transform into an animal, and are known for taking and eating the young. That, at my age, was particularly terrifying. But one of the elements of the story that my aunt told to me was that before the lady who was followed by the animal passed away, in the morning she had actually broken a glass, which was said to be a precursor to her demise. The only thing I recalled the night before was hearing a particular bird song which frightened me. This convinced me in that moment that I also was doomed, and so ran inside as quickly as I could, closed the door, and that was that. I don't think anything else happened, but it scared the life out of me for years to come. I don't think it was an ordinary cat, and I know for sure it wasn't my imagination. I woke up at night for a glass of water. I walked into the kitchen and ran into my dad. He walked right past me to the front door, didn't even acknowledge me being there. "Where are you going?" I asked him. He didn't say anything and just had a blank stare and walked out the door. I walked over and looked out the window, looked through the peephole, and we had a small walkway that connects to our driveway. He was sitting on the hallway hunched over, elbows on his knees under a big tree. That was in front of my bedroom, just staring into nothing. I walked into my mum's bedroom and asked her why Dad was outside. She turned over and said, "What do you mean, he's right here?" There was my dad, laying by my mum's side, in a deep sleep. I've never seen shadow people from my peripheral vision. They're always a few feet away from me, but right in front of my field of vision. I've only ever seen them at night, when my room is quite dark. Generally something rouses me in my sleep. I'll open my eyes, and there it is, a dark, humanoid figure, which I always initially assume is a family member out of bed and trying to awake me for some reason. I'll then ask them what they're doing or why they awoke me. But when they say nothing and remain still, I'll grow annoyed and continue repeating my questions until they just gradually dissolve before my very eyes. This is the moment where the fear sinks in, and I realize this clearly wasn't the family member I thought I was just aggressively speaking to. My point here is that these dark humanoid figures are already present, so I don't see how they materialize in the first place. As I lay beneath my covers, I kept my eyes on the corner of my room at the foot of my bed. As I stared into the patch of darkness and shadow where the two walls met, I felt like my eyes were playing tricks on me, because it looked as if the shadow was undulating. I kept my eyes fixed to the space, and slowly but surely the shadow grew larger and morphed into this big, dark, round humanoid figure. I say rounded because it was kind of like a featureless, heavy-set Santa body made out of super dark shadow. I'd never seen anything like this before. He was wearing a hat. He had a kind of large sombrero and just stood there motionless once manifested, and seemed to be made completely from shadow, as though the thing just pulls in and sucks in a patch of deep shadow from a space in the room and uses that to form his space. It was a really trippy experience, and I was a kid and quite scared and remained stock still, staring in shock for at least 20 seconds, trying to gain the courage to scream out to my parents in the next room. I still remember counting to 3 in my head before I finally had the guts to scream, "Mom!" I closed my eyes while screaming, so this time I wasn't able to watch the thing depart or dissolve. My parents took mere seconds to enter my room, and once they were there, my eyes opened, and I looked straight back into the corner and the thing was gone. I never saw one like that again. The others are always quite skinny. One thing for sure though, each time I've had an encounter with a shadow person, even though I've now had quite a few, I'm always equally and unsuspecting at the time before, and I always feel the same initial frustration while not receiving a response, right up until that cold fear takes over upon their eerie and unexplainable departure. Let me start off by saying that this happened 4 years ago, when I was 15 on a muzzleloader mule deer hunt in the far northeastern part of Utah, which contains some of the most remote and beautiful places in the state. I've been frequently out in this area, spreading in Summit County, that cuts in and out of lower Wyoming since before I can remember, including lots of hiking, backpacking, camping, hunting, and being involved in some of my grandfather's work. I am skeptical of things not proven by methods of science, but I don't deny all of those things. I find it's impossible for science to know of all that is out there in our vast world. My grandfather is a recently retired biologist and former conservation officer for the state, and was a regional specialist of wildlife and habitat management for many years. He's done everything from habitat management programs, controlled fires to benefit areas, to quite literally wrangling moose to be transplanted, and darting black bears. He's seen mountain lions, bears, birds of all kinds, small mammals, ruminants, plants, and natural phenomena for the majority of his life, and he understands so much that many people, including myself, will never be able to even begin to imagine. He's scientific, honest, straightforward, level-headed. He's agnostic and not superstitious, and often used to, lovingly and respectfully, tease a certain co-worker who thinks Bigfoot, skinwalkers, and other beings exist. Other than this experience, he has never encountered an animal that he could not at least partially, if not completely, identify, and other than the natural, innate fear of being in close quarters with bear, drunken, belligerent hunters, or incredibly potent tranquilizer medication, he's told me over and over he's never been terrified of an animal or experience like this, only curious or surprised. It was late September, and we were in a small camp by a lake in the high Uinta Mountains, hunting both grouse and mule deer with muzzleloaders. The camp was a small collection of men and women my grandfather had worked with over the years, and a supervisor/biologist, and others, people I'd grew up with as well. One of the women, a new wife to one of the guys, had shot a buck deer, injuring but not killing it immediately, and they had lost track of it. Devastated by the thought of wasting the animal, she returned to camp in the afternoon upset, and concerned that the deer had run into an even more secluded area of the mountains, which was hard to reach for the trail that she had shot from. A place my grandfather was familiar with because it was such a pain in the ass to get to, with lots of deadfall and steep terrain. We volunteered to go in the late afternoon to search for the deer, following a scant blood trail that she had tracked for a while before getting fatigued and intimidated by the terrain. Because both my grandfather and I were in good shape, and he was so familiar, it didn't seem like a big deal. Before we left, she mentioned hearing that she assumed coyotes were in the area, which made her even more concerned that if the deer lived, they would ruin the meat and hide before she could harvest it. We took off in the early evening, expecting to be back within an hour or two after searching and having our weapons with us, in case we found the animal still alive or came across another buck worth trying to harvest. It was steep in places with lots and lots of deadfall, of varying heights, making the hike slower and more tedious than we had hoped, making us understand the other hunters' fatigue. She had marked the blood trail with bright orange pieces on the trees, which we followed for 20 minutes, and then it got harder to track. The sun was getting close to setting at this point, and we knew getting out would be just as long as getting in. We had just about decided to stop when we found a spot near a fallen tree that looked like it had been recently bedded down in, followed with spatters of fairly fresh blood, and we continued for longer. When the sun had just about set, and the light had faded from the trees, we removed the firing caps from our guns to make them completely safe, as it was now illegal and irresponsible to hunt in such absence of decent light. My grandfather pulled out his large maglite flashlight from his backpack, and I put my headlamp on to begin the hike back using our GPS to find the trailhead. 10 minutes on the way back, we started to hear more movement among the trees. It was normal for animals to start moving now that the sun had gone down, as animals would likely be starting to head towards a clearing for water or to graze in the safety of lower lights. Small and distant sounds of crunching leaves, patterings of hooved animals, or small bits of movement of the trees from squirrels or birds were common and expected. We did not expect to hear the deafening, disturbing sound we heard next, which vaguely and initially reminded me of a coyote howl, but by a few seconds, it was unidentifiable, frightening and human-like. It started with what sounded like a person screaming, but then got louder and more intense with a screech to it, so unlike any coyote or any animal we had ever heard. Then was the almost chittering that came in between the shrieks, and the movement of the trees becoming almost calculated, almost threatening. We stopped dead in our tracks, frozen as my grandfather started using the light to look around. I was far more freaked out than him at this point. He just seemed perplexed, curious, and a little baffled at what could make that sound. It sounded human, but with no words, with no urge of tone of help, or I'm screaming just to mess with you. We continued on after it mostly stopped, and it seemed like the other natural and distant sounds had gone almost silent. I listened intently to the sound of my boots crunching, with the dry aspen leaves underfoot, trying to tell myself that it was just some weird coyote with a horribly deformed larynx or something. Maybe 20 minutes from the main trail that would lead us to the truck, we heard the chittering sound again, the sounds of thumping against dead trees. Looking around us with our lights, in between deadfall, maybe 12 to 15 feet in front of us, was a large human-looking thing. It was almost hunched down, with long, slender arms around the front of a standing aspen. The aspen, of course, was pale white, with the knots being dark brown, and whatever it was had skin almost as pale. I caught a very brief glimpse of its face. It seemed round, and the eyes seemed sunken, and I could not tell you the color other than a flash of reflection on the eye from my light, and that its face seemed sunken and emaciated. I didn't see any fur or hair. I never felt like it looked right at me. More my grandfather, and just in our direction, almost confused and curious, like he was before the sound. For a mere couple of seconds I caught a glimpse of it, but that was it. I looked down at the ground, holding my eyes shut tight, trying to imagine being safe and secure in the truck, and my grandfather took a few stumbling steps backwards towards me. I heard the thing go off to our side, moving quickly and with purpose through the trees, to the side, and then drop down behind us. That's what I would assume according to the sound, but I hoped it went in the opposite direction. My grandfather turned to where it had veered off, as to follow it, but he soon stopped and looked at me. I have never before, and never since, seen him so confused, baffled, horrified, curious, and in awe. I was crying at this point, ugly crying, trying to muffle my shaking breath and voice, and I asked him, "What was that?" Over and over I asked him, yet he had no answer for me. He pulled his gun off his shoulder and put a cap back on the nipple of the igniter, making the gun live, and then he carried it in front of his body in his arm. He pulled out another headlight and put it on himself. We started walking again towards the trail, as he listed off, as like talking to himself, to what it wasn't. Things like, could have been a deer or elk, moose, had arms. It was hunched, it stood upright. Or a bear, a very sick bear? It could have been a bear. Was it the light? We heard the sound, the screeching human howl, distant once more, before reaching the trail, which was dirt and gravel, but fairly flat and no deadfall. We practically jogged to the truck. I locked the doors immediately and sobbed, and my grandfather turned on music as loud as possible to try and distract me on the way back to camp. I was a mess when we arrived back, and he went to talk with the others by the fire, when he got me settled in my sleeping bag in my bunk. He explained to some of his friends, but I don't know what they all said. The next day everyone was extra sweet to me, trying to comfort me, saying it was probably a sick animal that looked scary in the dark. The deer the hunter shot was found the next day in the daylight, scavenged quite harshly by what I assume was coyotes. To this day he has no clue what it was, nor what that sound was, and before and since I've heard both coyote and many other animal sounds that never even compared to that one. The scientist in me and in him, the hopeful and blissfully ignorant people in us, hope and speculate. It was just a deformed sick animal in scant light. But I have no clue of what that thing was, and I hope I never experience it again. Does anyone have any ideas? This was back in 2012, a simpler time. Let me preface this by saying that the room I stay in my parents' house, used to be my grandfather's room. It's sort of like an apartment. It's got its own kitchen and bathroom. He passed in 2005, and I moved into the room in 2009. Ever since I moved back, every once in a while, I'll feel a presence in the room. Someone sitting at the edge of the bed or holding my hand, or I feel like someone's standing behind my shoulder. This is never ever threatening, and I never feel in danger because I believe it's Grandpa. But in October of 2012, I was doing my junior practicum student teaching. This is a sort of program where you go in once a week to a school and observe before real student teaching starts. It was a Tuesday night, and I only remember this because I went to the school on Wednesdays. It was a considerable distance from my house, so I tried to get into bed early. This one night I had trouble getting to sleep, which I never have. I can usually pass out anywhere at any time, and I begin to feel anxiety come over me, and a state of panic. Another thing that never happened to me. In my mind's eye, I kept envisioning a tall, black, humanoid figure with a long, red tongue standing in the corner of my room, and at the time it felt very vivid. But now I can't recall any details about this figure except that tongue. I began to feel like if I stayed in my room any longer, I would be in serious danger. I went into the next room, our family room, and decided to watch TV. I looked above the TV at the cable box and noticed it was 2:59 a.m. The second the digital clock hits 3, the sound of crickets coming from inside the room and the attached laundry room resounded. Once that box hit 3:01, everything stopped. Now I'm not a religious person, but my supervising teacher at school is. He told me that crickets are related to locusts, referring to the biblical plague, and he told me to recite the prayer to St. Michael. He couldn't remember it at that moment though, even though he said he used to say it every day. Getting home that day, and accompanying days, it seemed as though there was a fog around my room, and the room felt different, just off. I would come home and lay on my bed for an afternoon nap, and the bed started to shake. It got to the point where my mother began to ask me if anything felt weird. She has her own experiences, but that's a different story for another day. Now, I live in New Jersey, and in October of 2012 we were hit by a hurricane, Sandy, and we were without power for about a week or so, and I was not sleeping in that room in the darkness. I moved my mattress upstairs to our living room. Every night that week, a bluish-grey fog came up from downstairs and circled the room, and I began to have dreams of religious icons and the Virgin Mary falling into pits of fire. I had soon realized that after I forgot my grandfather's birthday, usually I'd light a candle at church or something for him. I thought perhaps he was angry with me, so I went to church and lit a candle, but it didn't change anything. A night soon after, however, I had a dream that I was driving with Grandpa down a road. It was pitch dark, a paved road, and it was bright white on either side like a desert. My grandpa had a really thick Irish accent, and sometimes it was really hard to understand him. But he said something along the lines of, always being there. The next morning I told my mom, while my younger brother was in the room, and he interrupted me and began filling in details of my dream for me. I asked him how he knew, and all he said was, I was in the back seat. The following night I had another dream. One of those hypernic jerk dreams where you start yourself awake, only I couldn't wake up. I was in a dead cornfield with naked androgynous grey children who were dancing around each other. They kind of looked like the kids on the cover of Led Zeppelin's House of Holy album. And from behind these children and up on the ground came a giant dark monster. It looked a bit like a dragon. I could see this creature clear as day. From behind it came a winged humanoid being, I guess an angel, which had a sword that stabbed the creature, and knelt down in front of me. I awoke, and at the foot of my bed was a white translucent figure. It hovered for about 10 seconds before vanishing. As I looked at it, I felt peace again, and I've never felt before. I don't think I'm going to ever feel that kind of peace again. The dream and everything stopped after that. I never told my youngest brother about the black figure, or the dragon, or the children, but fast forward a year later, I come home from work and my brother is sitting on the kitchen table looking shaken. He tells me he had a bad dream of naked children dancing around a dead cornfield and a black dragon behind him. No angel came, but he told me when he got ready for school and left, looking out of the window of his room was a large black figure with a long red tongue. It was the last I ever heard of it. I'm not particularly religious, but I can tell you ever since that event, I slept with the lights on and have had routine sleep paralysis. My friend and I were always big into the paranormal and exploring haunted places. One night, we decided to go out into the woods in the current state I live in and go to an abandoned camp that was used during World War II to keep Japanese prisoners. I forgot the proper name of what they were called, but I remember that was what he told me it was. It was miles away from where I live, deep among these winding dirt roads, something both he and I were very concerned about. My sister was with us at the time, but I don't think they saw what I did. It was getting dark, about 7 p.m. at the time, and we thought it would be perfect to go searching for cryptids, as it fascinated us. We're just kids, you know. I thought we wouldn't find anything, as I wasn't a strong believer in the paranormal. So we were driving down the dirt road, and I feel my whole body involuntarily go rigid, like it stiffened all the way up to my joints. I'm in my early 20s, so this was a very strange experience for me, but I dismissed it. As soon as we passed the water, so did the feeling. I went to ball my hands into fists, and my hands cracked, almost as if I had been sitting still for decades. This is where I wish I made him turn around. I got this feeling like I was being watched, and turned my head to look out the window. And I look into the forest while he and my sister got out the Jeep, searching for what it was, but I couldn't see it. Shrugging it off and dismissing it, I stepped out the car, thinking it to be my overactive imagination or my ADHD playing up. God, I honestly wish it had been. We decided to search for the remains of that camp, the one I mentioned earlier, and that is when he and I heard it. He heard multiple voices, or so he claimed. I did too, and the only house around was the one across the lake. It was wintertime, which means it was dead silent. The only noise was the soft breathing coming from my sister, my friend, and myself. The silence was so eerie, like there was something smothering any sound with a blanket of nothing. Thinking about it now honestly gives me the creeps. I kept beating myself up over it because I should have known. My ex lurched up and said we needed to go. He just said we had to leave. I brandished his pocket knife and told my twin to get in front of me and move. That was when I made the mistake of looking behind me and seeing two boys standing at the edge of the water with their backs to me. I squinted to look at them, and I'll never forget what I saw next. One of them turned to look at me with those eyes. It didn't look like there was anything there. And if it wasn't for that sense of fear I felt when looking into that void, I could have sworn it was just because it was dark. I snapped back to what I was doing and stood defensively as I made my way back up the hill, the staring sensation intensifying. I felt worse, and I felt like I was being followed. I looked at my sister and told her to get into the car. She took her time and I told her to hurry the hell up or my ex to climb in, and we took off. That sensation followed me through the woods until we got to the main road. What the hell were those two kids? This happened in an old farmhouse a few miles away from where I live, and the case is unsolved today. I live in Bavaria, Germany. It's an area with a lot of mountains and forests. This incident happened over 100 years ago. The family who lived in the farmhouse, along with its two workers, experienced many strange paranormal things, like foot trails in the snow which just led to nowhere, a few meters to the edge of the forest perhaps, and strange sounds at night, and the youngest daughter was telling the family that she was often visited by a tall man at night. One morning the whole family was found dead in their beds. Everyone had their heads smashed in with a blunt object. There were no signs that someone broke in, and the doors were all locked when the police arrived. Nothing was taken from the family, not even the gold necklace that the mother owned, which was right beside her bed and should be obvious if it were a burglary. The police also stated that there had been a lot of hate involved in the crime due to the brutality. The police investigated the crime scene, but didn't find anything. Another weird thing that happened in the barn. They locked it to investigate it later because there wasn't anything remarkable at first. But when they later returned, there was a rope with that hanging knot hanging from the ceiling. No one knew how it got there. Well, the case is around 100 years old, and if it happened nowadays, the police probably would be able to solve it with modern technology. But the paranormal things surrounding the house really creeped everyone out. I've never visited the farmhouse, but many say it's still haunted. I'm not sure about that personally. 20 years ago, I was sleeping beside my husband and I woke up. As I was turning over, I look over at my husband's shoulder and saw a woman standing in the bedroom doorway staring at my husband intently with curiosity. She then began moving towards him. She had no idea I was watching her. When she began walking towards him, I got angry, and I was going to launch myself over him and tackle her, but she was too far away. I was concerned I would wake my husband, and he would get up suddenly, causing me to hurt him. Instead, I turned over, got out of bed, and went around. But by the time I got to the end of the bed, she was gone. This was no common intruder. She was approximately 5 feet tall, very slim, but with a definite female figure, around 100 pounds. She was not clothed, but looked like a solid silhouette, or as if head to toe in a skin-tight black bodysuit. She did not have hair on her silhouette. Why can I describe her so well? She was less than 12 feet away from me. And this was not the first time seeing the paranormal, so no shock or fear. But although I did not mind paranormal encounters, I do not let them come near my husband. Can anyone give any hints as to what she was? She seemed solid. I could not see through her or any details in the hall. She was darker than the surrounding night, but it might have been the moonlight, and we have skylights in the living room downstairs. When she realized I saw her, she stopped and felt surprised. I have also found info on shadow men, but this is a woman, not a shadow, and not sinister. Does anyone know what this could possibly have been? The Pacific Northwest is a place of wonder, and where we believe creatures of lore exist. There have been too many various sightings here. I wouldn't say demonic in nature, more like there are tangible beings. The skies are vast, the air is clean, and there is a mystic feeling here. Almost as if when you turn a corner, you might see a fairy. We never want to live anywhere else. I've been renting a farm-style house with my 2 grandchildren, my son and his fiancée, for almost 3 years now. We have a well under the back of our house, and a pump house behind us. There are about 10 acres of land looking out towards Mount Rainier, and we have a 2-car garage connected to a big workshop, and next to us is a forest. All the things I will be describing have been spread out since we have lived on this property. Sometimes we hear screams coming from the forest, and all the wildlife becomes still and quiet. Occasionally we've listened to what sounds like a metal chair scraping on a concrete floor in the distance that echoes over our land. I've spoken to the young man and his brother who currently live on the same lot but closer to the forest, and they told me that they hear it too, but stay in after dark because it feels like they're being watched. They all think there's something off with this land. His brother also shared that he sees a demon boy, as he put it, in his room, as well as other places in the house. I ask him why he calls him a demon, in which he replies, because he scares me and messes with my stuff. I don't really think it is a demon, but what he saw and what we saw in our house will be for another time to tell. As for the noises in the forest, I have compared these sounds to various wildlife indigenous to the area but found nothing. This was when we first moved here on the property that is surrounded by farms. One late night I was driving down the lonely road home lit only by a handful of streetlights when I saw a flash of eyes in the distance. Not wanting to hit what I thought might be a deer, I slowed down. When I arrived at where I thought it was gone. But the side of the headlights shined on something greyish-white, and I noticed something almost the size of a man crawling into the bushes. I saw its back muscles and shoulder blades, and its back leg. There was no fur, no tail, and no feathers, just light-coloured muscles. I quickly turned the corner, hoping to see it crawl over the train tracks on the other side of the bushes, but it wasn't there, so I went home. I know what I saw in my headlights. I'll try to compile all that we have seen in these 3 years. We know there is something going on with this land. My 2 adult children, my son's fiancé and I, have seen this tall white creature. It stands about 7 feet tall with large eyes peeking around the workshop, revealing its head, chest, shoulder, arms and its hands on the wall, and part of its foot, or it peeks into the garage window. And we have seen this on many occasions, a few times from my son's window upstairs. My daughter was here for a visit once. She thought she dropped something earlier out back when she was playing with the kids in the yard. It was dark, so she and my son went out there and they both had flashlights to find whatever it was she dropped. They were searching for a while, when they heard something rustle in the tall grass beyond them. She shined her light in the direction of the noise, and standing there in the field was the same creature. So they both ran like hell back to the house. She later moved out of state, and it's been over a year since this happened. So before I wrote this, I gave her a call. I didn't want to lead the conversation, so I simply asked her what she remembered. She described that thing to a T, and went on by telling me about the time she saw it on the roof of the garage, where both awnings meet. She stepped out onto the front porch and something caught her eye over the garage. She said she stepped closer and it tilted its head. My daughter then turned to tell her brother to look, and when she looked back it was gone. Then of course, she had to ask me, "Don't you remember me telling you when you thought I was on drugs?" I do remember that, and I apologized. I don't think this or these things have an intent, or at least I would hope not. It's just scary. On an earlier evening, my son and his fiancée were leaving the garage from the side door, and my son locked eyes with this same thing crouched on all fours on a lawn couch outside my bedroom window. He said it was white with pasty skin, and had a long neck with big round eyes that almost glowed. Its head stayed fixed on him, and straight, but moved up and around clockwise and back like it was sizing them up like an owl. It was crouched with knees. It was not an owl. My son then started pushing his girl faster to the house. It was a while before they went back over there, never alone and never at night. Just to let you know, we have never seen a raccoon or squirrel on the property. Another time I was on my front porch one evening. I let the dogs out one last time before bed and noticed that they were acting all skittish. They did their thing and piled it up in front of the door with crazy eyes as if they wanted to go in now. Thinking it might be coyotes, I let them in and went to the end of the porch to see what was frightening them. I kept a light on above the back door and another one further down on another area of the back of the house. Something was tall enough to block out the light, casting its shadow on the wall of the garage. It couldn't have been a giant moth on the light because the shadow was cast by both lights. That gave me the creeps to think about that something was standing right outside my back door. My granddaughter keeps her window blinds shut after dark, even though there is no one around. She says she feels uneasy. We are not living in fear by any means, it's just different. This hasn't been an everyday occurrence, but it is enough to take notice. I have no explanation as to what it is. At first I blew it off, thinking it was just some sort of wildlife we didn't know about before. But after seeing these things for almost 3 years and getting validation from others, I know that it is so much more. Maybe someday before we move, and I ever get my hands on some proper camera equipment with night vision, I will share my findings. While I was in the Navy, I messed around and ended up invoking a deal with a demon. One in particular, Mammon. I messed around with this stuff for about 6 months and nothing ever came of it. Since then, I had exceedingly good luck up until recently. Fast forward about 8 years and life kind of sucks, living paycheck to paycheck after moving and leaving the Navy. But I've recently got into a relationship about 5 months ago with a green witch and her roommate, an alleged psychic. They reaffirmed a lot of beliefs that I already had, but never told them about this demon thing, because in all honesty I had forgotten about it. But about a month into the relationship, her roommate had a demon visit them in a dream and tell them that I was his. There were 2 dark figures, one large and overbearing and a smaller one. So her and her roommate came up to me the next day and were like, "Have you ever messed around with demons?" And I was like, about 8 years ago? They did a reading on me and found out the actual name without me saying it to them. But apparently, I cannot do anything to rid myself of the demon until I complete the terms of the deal, which I cannot for the life of me figure out. I'm pretty sure the demon doesn't want me to figure it out either. It's not like I feel like he's trying to harm me in any way or anyone around me, but what I can tell you is that I've had nightmares for a solid 8 years, and my luck and success has been eerily low as of recent. I wish I could find out what he wants, but I doubt that's gonna happen. My family moved into a new home about 4 years ago, and I've always had an off feeling about the house, but I put it down to paranoia. I woke up in the middle of the night with scratches all over my body, but I had no reason to think I wasn't doing it in my sleep. I moved on to being a college student living on campus. I haven't woken up with scratches once. Now home for the holidays, the first night staying back in the house, I woke up with scratches. I stayed again and woke up with scratches the next morning, and my girlfriend finally made me realize it was only happening when I was staying home. So I stayed at her house for around 4 days and didn't get scratched once. Now writing this, I had just stayed in my house again last night and woke up with a scratch on my side, and now I feel more creeped out than ever. I don't own any pets, and due to living on campus, my old room was taken over by my younger brother, so this happened sleeping in 2 different rooms. I've read about others' experiences, and next time I will sleep with gloves. I honestly don't want to wake up with new scratches. The thought of it is terrifying. This happened when I was in high school, roughly 2000 to 2004. I had woken up at around 4 a.m. with a knocking on my window. I could hear the low hum of a car idling, and I went to the window and peeked through the blinds. There was a girl's face. Even though my window was closed, I could hear her speak clearly. "Is Nick home?" That's my brother. Since it was a girl asking for my brother, I instantly thought it was his girlfriend, and my brother used to come home really late at night, or early morning, depending on your perspective, and I didn't know if he was home or not, and told her I would go check. I went to my brother's room and he wasn't there. I returned to the window, and since I thought it was my brother's girlfriend, who I knew, I raised the blinds all the way up to this point. But it wasn't his girlfriend. My brother's girlfriend is tall and has blonde hair. This girl was short, had black hair and a ponytail, and I could see a car in the driveway too, which is what I was hearing. I told her he wasn't home, and she seemed nervous, and said to herself, "Nick, where are you?" I told her that he hadn't come home yet, and she walked away. I closed the blinds and went back to sleep, and laid in bed thinking about it. I didn't ever recall seeing the girl's eyes. It didn't occur to me in my half-sleepy state as I was speaking to her, but upon reflection, it seemed to me like her eyes were missing. I told my brother about her the next day, and he seemed to have no idea who it could have been. He could have been lying because my brother has been known to cheat on his girlfriend, so it could have been a cover-up. I know I wasn't dreaming, because this felt so real, and I've never had a dream like this before. Could it have been a black-eyed kid? But it did seem weird that she didn't appear to have eyes. Another thought occurred to me. I can't remember the exact time, but one of my brother's past girlfriends passed away in a terrible accident when she was underneath a jacked-up mobile home cleaning underneath it, when it fell and crushed her. They were broken up at the time. Perhaps it was her phantom, coming back to say goodbye. One last time. Not to mention my brother's ex-girlfriend had short black hair and tended to wear ponytails. This story took place roughly 30 years ago. Me and my best friend Emma were rebellious teens. We were both 15 and hated going to school. It just wasn't our scene. At the time, we lived fairly close to each other and would often hang out at each other's houses. We'd sometimes even skip going to school and explore the local woods so that no adults could see us. It was on these excursions that we found the house of an old lady. Her name was Mrs. Bateman. We never got to meet her, but we saw her and said hello. That's about the extent of our conversation. Her house was in the middle of the woods, decrepit, practically falling to pieces, and she seemed absolutely insane, talking to herself while sitting in the garden on a chair that was surrounded by forest. It was an extremely odd place for a house, and we assumed that it must be because she owned the land, and were worried that we were potentially trespassing. But at 15, you'd think you're above the law and everything else. Well, one day, we hear, through some mutual friends, neighbors and stuff, that the lady, the crazy lady specifically, that lived in the woods had passed away. The very next day, we're talking about it at school. And seeing as I really didn't want to do geography, me and Emma decide to head up into the woods to see if we can see the house, maybe even the dead lady. Obviously, she'd been removed by this time, but we were teenagers and quite oblivious to how the world works. We started setting off. It was around 2 p.m. because we were skipping our final lesson. As we were walking through the forest, we knew no one would be none the wiser. This is where Emma started to pipe up, saying she had a bad feeling about doing this. My only intention, of course, was to look at the house from the outside. I never really had any intention of going in, and just to see if I could see the body. There was this morbid fascination surrounding me. I wanted to know what happened to this woman and why she suddenly passed. What made people say she was crazy? And how did they know she was dead? I convinced Emma to carry on going, despite her relentless protests. It took us about 20 minutes of walking when we finally reached the house. There was no one there, which surprised me at first. As we approached the door, we looked through the windows, cautiously, scared that she might jump out at any moment despite people saying that she'd passed. There was no one in sight. That's when I got the guts to try the door. I slowly lowered my hand to the handle, started pulling down. At that very moment, it opened, and I had a satisfying grin cover my face. Emma was scared. She dared not venture into someone's house without permission, but I did. I told her that we'd be quick. We'd just be exploring. No one was home, and the lady had passed away anyway. As far as we knew, she didn't have anyone to leave the house to or anything, so we were doing everyone a public service by seeing if there was anything worth taking. I know, it was pretty crappy of me. Spoilers, I never actually took anything. In truth, I was just trying to entice Emma to go in, but that's neither here nor there. Anyway, continuing with the story. She followed me in because I wasn't going to stay outside, and looking up at the sky, it looked like it was going to rain. So, I guess all of the reasons meant that she was going to come in. The house, as I mentioned before, wasn't in a very good state. She was a hoarder. There were newspapers piled up all around the place. The electricity was still working, but it was a dingy little place. We looked around the kitchen, and it smelled disgusting. Clearly, she hadn't washed dishes in a long time. There was food waste accumulated on plates and stuff that was going moldy. She'd only been dead a few days, I thought. How could all of this have accumulated so quickly? In any case, we carried on looking around. The house didn't have a very welcoming atmosphere, but I just assumed I felt uncomfortable being on someone else's property when deep down I knew I really shouldn't be. We went up the stairs. The rooms were bare and barren, except her room, which had a whole host of trinkets on the little sideboard and table. Then we saw the last door at the end of the upstairs hallway. We tried to open it, but there was a small catch above us that appeared to have a lock. At that moment, Emma recalled that there was a tiny key which seemed to fit the lock over on the dresser in the other room. She went over, fetched it, and like a charm it worked. We opened the door and were instantly hit with a wave of cold. We wondered if this was because this part of the house was in disrepair, but regardless, we took up the wooded stairs and started making our ascent. It's important to note that her house was carpeted, but these stairs were wooden, which gave it an extra creepy feel. There was no light switch as we were going up, so we were going up in full darkness nearly. By the time we reached the top, we tried using our hands to see if we could find any form of switch, when finally we found one, an old-fashioned one. We flipped it, and we were greeted by the darkness of the loft. There wasn't really much about. A few picture frames covered by a sheet, an old chair, nothing really of interest nor value. It was interesting to be up here. Having been in lofts before, I knew that you had to be careful, as there were lots of beams and wooden planks, and stepping in the wrong place could mean you fall through the ceiling, as it's not that stable. After we had a good look around, We were just about to leave when my friend Emma shrieked and ran downstairs. I asked her what was wrong, but she didn't reply. I looked around the loft room and didn't see anything, and just as I was about to flip the switch and make my way down, did I look directly into one of the corners of the house, near an area I hadn't really been paying attention to. There was a figure, a shadow. It almost looked like a man, just standing in the corner, slightly crouched. All I could make out was the shape, no features. I stared at it, I blinked, and it was still there. At that point, I just about crapped my knickers and decided to run down the stairs, leaving the light switch on out of pure fear. Emma had already made it down the second set of stairs and was just about to leave the house, screaming at me to run out. I bolted, left the house, and we fled and went home. We were chilling at our house for a while, talking about what had gone on, hoping that my brother wouldn't overhear, as he had been at school, and we really didn't want him to know that we hadn't been there. After saying in whispers how freaked out we were, we both asked each other what we'd seen, and when we concurred it was the same shadow man, did our excitement fade to fear. We really hoped we hadn't disturbed something, and that's when we realized we never even closed the door. It was about 6 p.m. at this point, and fairly dark. The forest and house weren't too far, but we really didn't want to go back. A part of me was worried someone may have seen us leaving that house, or that we might get in trouble. Now, the teenage stupidity had all but dissolved, and was left the real possibility that we could get in trouble for our stupidity. We knew we had to go back. No one closed the door. I even left the light on upstairs. What if people saw? What if people knew it was us? We gathered up our courage and a torch and started making our way back in the dark. The streetlights guided us most of the way, and that's when we got to the entrance of the forest. We walked in with our torch to guide us. It wasn't the best, visibility was limited, but we made it to the house with the torchlight. When we arrived though, the door was closed, but the light was still on upstairs and was leaking through and could be seen from one of the top windows. Emma said she didn't want to go in, but went in anyway, as I knew it was my responsibility. She had the decency to wait at the bottom of the stairs and said that if she heard me shout she was going to run, and she'd meet me in the forest as she had the torch. I flipped on the light switches and started making my way up the stairs, hoping to hell I didn't see anything. My eyes were darting around the house, absolutely terrified, scared that at any moment this shadow man would appear out of nowhere and do who knows what to me. Every step was painful, and when I made it to the upstairs landing I took a sigh of relief as there was nothing. That's when I saw the door. The door was closed. The upstairs door, I mean, the one that would take us to the loft. I had most certainly left it open, but perhaps in my haste, it had bounced back or something. Although it was open the whole time, I tried not to think about it, and I didn't want to make any noise, so I took off my shoes and started slowly creeping up the stairs. However, one of the wooden steps betrayed me, and it made a loud creak. I just about had a panic attack there and then, hoping that the entity wouldn't hear me. I was going up step by step. I could see the light switch. I was just about to flick it, and then I did. A wave of relief washed over me, as I crept down a little louder now, content that I had done what I needed to do. I slipped on my shoes and started making my way downstairs. But when I got to the bottom, Emma was no longer there. Oh no, I thought. Where did she go? The door was closed and I never heard it open. Me being as quiet as possible, I doubt she would have left. So instead of opening the door, I looked out of the little square window in the door, but there was no light around. I walked out of where the stairway was and into the living room to see Emma stood stock still and terrified, staring into the kitchen area. I instantly saw what was scaring her. There was the shadow. It was now a lot more pronounced than before. The light leaking in from where we were was meeting the darkness of the kitchen, but it was very clearly visible. It was radiating a dark and fearful aura. Maybe this is why the old woman went insane, I thought. And with that, I grabbed her hand, closed the door on our way out, and ran like I've never ran before. I don't think in all my life I've run any faster. This was Usain Bolt proud speed. We made it back to my house, sweating, panting, crying, and hugging at the end. We were so relieved and vowed not to get up to any mischief again regarding people's property we shouldn't be in the first place. That's our story. We never saw the Shadow Man again, or even approached that house. We stayed out of the woods for a long time. In a way, I think this experience helped us, as we were too scared to even venture out of school, and ended up passing all our grades reasonably well. But we both never forgot. Even though as we grew older our friendship drifted apart, in my 50s I actually moved back to the area, and she had never left. A few years ago we were talking at a bar, and this event came up. We spoke of our memories and how terrifying it was, and both could relate exactly the same thing to each other. I knew it was never just a story. It really happened. But God, it was the scariest moment of my life, and really made me believe that there's something else out there. In 2016, I went to study abroad for a year in Munich, Germany. I went to plenty of places in this time, local towns to explore, and further regions of the country for hiking. I got to know this girl in my program, and we started spending more time together as we were both from the Detroit area and went to the same university. I liked her. I was a 19-year-old male and she was a 20-year-old female. She liked me. And I was a bit more spontaneous with exploring, with the idea of being as random as possible. This particular day was December 26th, and we were at Marienplatz, a central location and subway station in Munich, deciding on where we wanted to go and what we wanted to do that day. I played a game with a friend back in the States called the Highway Game, where we would just drive, take random highways, and take exits randomly to get as lost as possible. And we would just have a good time talking during our time, trying to get back home without any use of GPS. Anyway, why this is important is because that's what I and my friend were doing at Marienplatz, just getting lost, which is how we ended up taking an S4S Bahn train towards Ebersberg. We still hadn't decided which exit we planned to take, as we were just sitting on the train and just waiting for the right moment to hop off. We decided to get off at the Baldum stop and begin to walk out of the station towards the village. We were in the beginning stages of talking, having had some close moments while talking, and this just felt like another timeless talking session with her. We walked around the town and eventually found some woods to walk through that were quite dense, covered with moss on the ground and tall pines everywhere. We made the mistake of going out in the early afternoon, and after an hour train ride arrived at around 3 p.m. And being in the middle of December, the sun was dropping quite quickly, making for a forest with a shadowy backdrop where I couldn't see much beyond 100 feet or so. We found a patch of thick moss void of any trees, which made for a nice spot to lie down and just stare at the clouds moving by. There wasn't any snow cover, and it was about 40 Fahrenheit, so not that cold. As we were sitting there taking it all in, I felt like it was a good moment to lean up and go in for a kiss. As I get up on my elbows looking at her, I noticed something moving in the background within the shadows, just darting between the trees. It wasn't more than a few seconds later than I realized whatever was darting between the trees was now darting towards us. I didn't think much of it since I thought maybe it had just been a dog, but as it got closer, I realized this thing was canine and huge. Before it reached us, I stood up, and it stopped within feet of us, just snarling and growling extremely loudly. I dragged my friend up and told her to just start walking away. I followed her but noticed that the canine creature walked in a circular path around us to the 3 o'clock position to where it stopped. I began to walk with her, and as I turned around to check where it was, I saw that it was gone. We never heard it leave or saw anything run away. The only thing we did hear was a howl about 30 seconds after we left from laying on the moss, at which point we decided to get the hell out of the woods. As we did, we came across a gentleman walking his small dog and greeted him and felt a sense of security, but nonetheless left as quickly as we could and went back to the station to catch the next train home. Now I know one of you may be thinking that it could have been a wolf, but later that evening I looked up to see if there were any wolves in the area, but found that the majority, if not all wolves, were killed following the expansion of human society on the continent, with the closest known population of wolves being near Poland, Ukraine and Russia. It could have been a very large dog, but let me tell you, I have dogs, and have grown up around dogs, and have been attacked by dogs before. I know what I saw. This was not your average canine. It looked wolf-like, but was huge. If anyone has any idea what happened, or is from the Munich area and knows of anything like this happening, please tell me, as my now girlfriend and I still talk about how freaked out we were by this. All I can say is that just as quickly as I noticed the canine, and as it tried to attack us, it was gone, making for a supernatural experience in my book. This didn't happen to me but my friend. Back in 1998, I was at 2nd grade and was coming home from school alone for the first time. I had a bit of overprotective parents since I lived about a block away from my school, and I was stopped by an elderly woman who said she had something to tell me. She said she had no husband, had lost her son years ago, and just wanted to give me a hug. Something about this woman gave me the creeps, and now later on thinking she did look and talk a bit weird, almost like she was a man dressed in old woman's clothes. But this could really just have been my juvenile imagination messing around. After asking me for a hug, she reached her hands towards me and motioned for wanting a hug. I took off and ran as fast as I could all the way home. As I ran, I heard her laughing really loud, in a low, manly laugh. When I got home, I told my mum about it, but she wasn't worried at all and told me that it was probably just an old and lonely woman who needed a hug. Here in Finland, we have this magazine called Alibi, which has the most recent news about burglaries, thefts, and all manner of terrible, terrible things. And for some reason, 8-year-old me was not allowed to go anywhere near this magazine, obviously. But a few weeks after the incident with the old woman, I did get my hands on a copy, which was brand new. I read about an incident that happened in the area in which I lived, about a boy my age last seen by his friends hugging an old woman and walking somewhere with her never to be seen again. The case is still unsolved today, 15 years later, and it gives me the shivers, as that could have been me. But I feel for that poor, poor boy. This event occurred on the 29th of October, 2019, between 6:23 and 6:27 a.m., Eastern Time Zone of the USA. My daughter, who was nearly 4 at the time, had woken me up that Tuesday morning right before Halloween. I felt awake and perky that morning, so I grabbed my black glasses and put them on my face, got out of bed, then stood facing the wall which the door is located on, to slip my feet into the purple woolen slippers as I do each morning. This morning, however, was different. I had an extremely difficult time getting my slippers on, no matter how I moved my feet. The slippers moved millimeter by millimeter, and my feet chased them, unable to slip inside. It would have been comical how much trouble I was having, or it would have been had it not been slightly irritating and frustrating. However, determined, I continued to slowly chase my slippers with my feet as I checked the time. The clock was by the door, and it illuminated that it was 6:24 a.m. Meanwhile, I watched my daughter bound towards the door, and despite my protests, she threw it open. Peering out into the dark hallway, I noticed something pure black, much darker than anything else, and began processing what this could possibly be. My dad had placed several items, a small bookcase and a lamp, as well as other stuff, outside the bedroom door on the wall opposite my bedroom door and the bathroom door to the left of my room. So I assumed the blackness was some sort of office equipment. Yet I continued staring, and an uncomfortable feeling began rising in my chest and stomach as I made out the shape of a nose on a head, and I was viewing this at an angle rather than head-on. My slippers were still not cooperating either, as I had the sudden thought, oh God, is that a shadow person? I chided myself, rolled my eyes and laughed internally, thinking I've been watching too many paranormal shows on the Travel Channel, or perhaps too much Mortis media. But at that moment my discomfort and sense of alarm grew, as I noticed that my daughter had not moved once she threw the door open. My eyes widened as I wondered, does she see it too? Looking back and forth between the blackness and my daughter, I suddenly realized that it could lift its arm and touch her. Frantically, I tried to get my feet into the slippers, but it was as if my foot and the slippers were opposing poles of a magnet. I literally could not get my foot inside, for some reason that I can't explain either. I had it in my head that I had to get my slippers on before moving to the other side of the room, so I continued to struggle with my stupid slippers, watching the darkness and my daughter stare at each other. Great parenting, I know, but I think the shadow person had a hand in it. By now, the time was 6:26. Suddenly, an idea popped into my head. I called my daughter over. "Baby, come here, please." And for once she obeyed, as the spell was broken. My slippers suddenly allowed my feet into them, and let me tell you, I had felt incredibly clumsy being able to put on a pair of slippers. By the time my daughter had walked the mere 3 meters to my side, I gave her a hug and looked up, and she nonchalantly said, "I saw a shadow." It felt as if all my internal organs dropped to the floor. Gasping, I stared at the door. The blackness was gone. It was 6:27 a.m. Where the blackness had been, there was just a lump with a white lampshade and a desk or bookshelf in a blonde shade of wood. Nothing could have possibly had the appearance of a jet black silhouette. Fast forward to yesterday, Thursday, May 14th, around 4 p.m. I walked down the same hallway, but when I stepped in front of the bathroom door, which was closed, did I see the light pop on and hear the fan start, as they're on a single motion sensor switch. Again, the door was closed, so it would be impossible for it to pick up any movement outside the bathroom. Just to be sure, I knocked, opened the door and peered inside. It was completely empty. Now this one I could have rationalized away, except the timing seemed so deliberate, as it was only about a meter from where my daughter and I had seen the shadow person more than 6 months before. A shiver ran up my spine as the memory came back to me. Every time I had to walk past that spot, since seeing the shadow person, I've been afraid, and I think the bathroom light was a bit of a reminder that he is still there. In early October 2015, I saw what I speculate to be an adult black-eyed kid. I was making up some Halloween masks in order to put into an antique mall where I have a booth. I looked up from the sofa and saw through a window to my left someone staring directly at my house. They were standing on a knoll directly across the street on a neighbor's lawn. I did not recognize this person and thought it might be some drug addict or homeless person. I lived in a rural area, but houses are side by side on 1-acre lots. She was dressed all in black, dark hoodie, loose ill-fitting pants above ankle length, odd flip-flop sandals like slippers that had one big strap across the foot and no socks. Being in October in Connecticut, it was cold. She had one hand holding a cell phone to her ear and the other arm was held straight down like a soldier. Very thin, white hair, white skin. I watched through the top glass of my front door. This person walked across the lawn of the neighbor's house and into their driveway, then turned towards my house again. I saw the black eyes. Terrified, I ran into the kitchen from the living room and locked the door. I saw it cross the street and go into my driveway, and I watched it walk to the end of my short driveway and vanish before my eyes. It appeared and disappeared from view, like from another dimension. I've been looking for a place to share this experience for a while, and I think I found it. This happened 10 years ago. I grew up in South Georgia, so there's a good bit of forest. It was around 11 or 12 at the time, and I lived in a small neighborhood in the woods. My family consisted of my mother, stepfather, sister and I, and we had about an acre of land to ourselves, bordered by about 500 to 600 acres of woods. We were in our side of the yard, sitting around a fire about 50 feet from the tree line. It was about 5 p.m. and we were all talking, joking around, and we were trying to scare my sister with a dumbass piggy man story. While everyone was still talking, I started to hear something. So of course I told everyone to be quiet and listen. Now, although I live in the south, we don't have many large animals. The largest we have are white-tailed deer and hogs. Deer have a very quiet step and generally avoid people. Hogs, on the other hand, are pretty loud, however, it's very easy to identify their noise. What we were hearing were steps, loud and heavy, and only steps, no digging, no grunting that a hog would make. So my stepfather decided to get his 3.06 and go investigate. Meanwhile, my sister was scared, and my mother took her back under the carport, away from the fire in the dark. I stayed by the fire and wanted to see the events that would transpire. While my mother called for me to come inside, so I turned to her to protest. Here's where it gets good. My mother got this look of confusion, I think, on her face. Now this made me turn around. At this point I'm standing 50 feet from the tree line and 20 from our door. I turned to see 10 feet away from me the biggest animal I've ever seen in my life. It was a foot taller than me, and I was 5 foot tall at the time. It looked like a dog. It was larger than a Great Dane and was built like a pit bull. Now my neighbor at the time had 2 Great Danes, but Danes are rather tall and thin. This thing was 2 feet taller than both her dogs, and it looked built enough to pull a semi-truck. This thing was sitting like a dog, and was still 6 feet tall, not on its hind legs. I froze for a second. It was sitting just at the edge of the fire, just close enough for me to make out most of the details. All it did was stare right in my eye. Finally, I realized I needed to move and bolted back to my door. One more thing. I was playing multiple sports at the time and was in decent shape, meaning I was not slow by any means. From the moment I started running to the moment I got to my door, probably took no less than 2 seconds. I get there, look back, and this thing had made it back to the tree line within the 2 seconds it took me to get to my door. It cleared 50 feet in 2 seconds from a dead start. Now I can't remember many details from the face. I do remember that it had no antlers and had pointed ears like that of a dog, a pit bull mix, and that it had very bright eyes. I don't remember the color though. My mother, sister and I sat in the kitchen to wait for my stepfather to return, and we hear a gunshot. Now I'll make a long story shorter, and just say that my stepfather came back to the house and he said he saw glowing red eyes and fired, at which point he wet himself and ran back to the house. I don't know how much stock to put into what he said, as he's well known to be a liar. I think I've put all the relevant information I can at that moment, but it's been killing me to know if anyone knows what this could have been, or if anyone else has seen it. I would absolutely love to talk about it. The first house that my mum and stepfather bought after they got pregnant with my sister had a few weird things happen. When she got old enough to communicate, she would wake up with a rash on her back crying about the bees on the ceiling. That was pretty much the extent of what happened in the actual house. But we had a detached garage probably 30 feet away from the back door of the house, and the garage had a loft that I decorated and hung out in when I was in my early teens. It started when I was jamming to music one day and thought I heard someone come in. Then being rattled through the toolbox downstairs, I shut my music off and called out to no one there. I turned my music back on a little while later, thinking I was hearing a quiet conversation going on as if someone was on the phone. I turned my music back off and called out again to no one. So I turned on my music quieter and swore I could hear some more rattling and someone open and close the door to leave. I packed up my stuff and go into the house to ask around, and nobody has been in the garage all day but me. I stopped hanging out up there. More and more I got a really eerie feeling about the garage, to the point where I don't like to even have my back to it in broad daylight because it makes me feel strange. Sometime later I was telling my friend about it and he was like, "Oh, my dad has a camera, let's see what happens when we leave the camera there." So in the evening, as the sun was setting, he gets his dad's camera and we sit up there facing the front room. In the garage you climb up a ladder in the back of the room, up into a large hole in the floor of the loft, and if you look towards the front of the room you can see where the barn doors of the loft crack open and leave in a bit of light. So this is a rectangular little camera that's got nothing fancy about it, very much like the ones that most people own. We have the lights off, set it facing the front, and as we descend I take note that there's a little blue light on the back of the camera as it's recording, since I've already been tasked with retrieving the camera when we're done, and I want to remember what I'm looking for. So we go and talk with my mum, who thinks I'm crazy. 20 minutes later we go up to fetch the camera and the blue light is gone. What the hell? I reach out and feel for it and realize the camera has rolled over, not even onto its flat screen, but then once more onto its narrow top side to face the back wall of the garage. I grabbed it and bolted faster than I ever had in my life. We watched the recording and sure enough, about 5 minutes later, after seeing nothing, we then heard a thud and watched the camera seemingly roll over alone with enough momentum to not stop on the wide flat side but to the next narrow end. We tried to leave the camera up overnight, but his dad came to get it and I never saw the recording again. This happened a little over 2 years ago, and I still think about it from time to time. It was October, and I was a senior in high school at the time, and had been sleeping in very late, as I had a terrible case of senioritis. When I woke up, my mother had just returned home, and I said my typical morning greeting to her in the kitchen. She had seemed somewhat surprised when she saw me, and eventually told me something rather alarming. About 30 minutes before I had awoken, she had seen my younger brother getting ready for school. As she had passed by the archway into the living room, She said she saw me standing next to the couch. She assumed I was waking up and groggy. She hadn't thought much of it and continued on her task of taking my brother to school. The rather alarming part is that not only had I still been sound asleep in my room, but she told me that I had been wearing a grey t-shirt with a specific design on it. At the time, I no longer owned that specific grey t-shirt. I'm not even sure where it went. I was also wearing a completely different t-shirt when I woke up. She said that I had just been standing there with my long dark hair obscuring my face. This chilled me to the bone, as one can only imagine. I got over it pretty quickly though, in the dismissive way a high school senior often does, but I still think about it from time to time. My parents' house has always been rather creepy. I had a few more odd experiences up until I moved out and into an apartment with my fiancé, then boyfriend. On a few occasions I've heard my name being called by my father when I was home alone. A pretty creepy encounter happened a few months after my mum had seen my imposter. I had been putting my shoes on in the dining area as I looked up, and I saw a greyish figure float by the window. It had gone by the first window and didn't continue into view of the second window. It completely vanished. It was broad daylight, as I had gotten a pretty good view of it, even though it had gone by rather fast. It seemed to be wearing a cloak, or a cloak-like grey hoodie. I remember grabbing my bag and running outside, heading down and leaving for school like a bat out of hell. My mother had also reported seeing orbs of light shooting across the ceiling on occasion, and hearing the occasional voice or two call her name, one of them being a child's voice. My parents' dog will sometimes whine at a specific wall in the living room before backing up and running down the hallway like he's terrified. This is alarming because he's a big 100-pound dog. Even my fiancé has experienced a few things. The creepiest by far being the sight of the same possible shadow person I had seen. This was right after I graduated. We'd been cuddling on my bed. I had my face against his chest and my back to the bedroom door. All of a sudden he stiffened and said, "Whoa." He said he saw something zip by the open doorway. It was almost as tall as the door, dark in color, and seemed to be gliding. It also looked to be wearing a cloak of some kind. This is just an estimate, but the door is 7 to 8 feet tall. When he told me this, I immediately thought of the dark, seemingly cloaked figure that I had seen a few months before that. He had also been scratched once by seemingly nothing. Something of these experiences are rather run-of-the-mill haunted house stuff. Others stand out and are more unnerving. The only people who haven't felt, seen, or heard anything odd are my father and brother. This has come to my mind once again, because a few weeks ago my parents had gone out of town, and I had stopped by to bring in their mail and borrow their vacuum, as mine had broken. As I walked through the house to grab the vacuum, a very sudden feeling of uneasiness fell over me. I felt the overwhelming feeling that something was nearby and watching me. I'm not gonna lie, I grabbed that vacuum and booked it out of there. I hardly wanted to lock the place up. Here's the thing. I've always been interested in the paranormal, but this all stumps me. I sometimes wonder if some of the events may have been caused by me. I had played with a Ouija board a few times with a friend when I was 15. There is also an abandoned house about a mile from my parents' home. Keep in mind this is in the middle of the country, long dirt roads and cornfields going nowhere. We'd walked there multiple times and taken pictures on the inside, with broken mirrors, pentagrams drawn on the walls, broken beer bottles, and totally unfinished walls and everything. We even found a child's shoe on this side of the house, and the skulls of some animals in the barn. We were creeped out. On one occasion, my friend, Ali, had turned and yelled, "Hi ghosts, we love you." Stupid, right? This messed up part is immediately after that. We heard a loud scream from the property of the house. It sounded almost like an animal. Needless to say, we didn't return after that experience. Weirdly enough, Any time I opened my Photos app to show other people the pictures we took, the app would crash and my phone would sometimes even die at full battery. Never had an issue with that phone. Afterwards, there were a few times Ali would stay the night and I'd be pinched seemingly out of nowhere and she'd feel her hair be pulled. This stopped after a month or so. Bad choices aside, I've researched all of this as much as I can and feel maybe it's time to get an outsider's opinion. I'm sharing this in the hope that someone might be able to get answers in regard to these odd happenings. More specifically, the ghost who stole my face and the mysterious cloaked shadow person. I'm also wondering why only myself, my mother and my fiancé have experienced these things. Perhaps we're more perceptive. My brother and father are skeptical. They don't buy into the paranormal at all. My fiancé is very skeptical too, and yet he's experienced these things and has never found an answer for them. He's experienced a few other rather messed up paranormal things in his childhood that he can't explain, but that's a story for another day. The creepiest thing I found suggested his scratches, the 3 long superficial slashes down his back. They could have been of demonic origin, which terrifies me. If anyone has any ideas, please let me know. I could really use with some help. I'm 14 years old. I'm from a hilly village in England. Recently I had been doing a project on urban legends. It was a class assignment, and most people did Bloody Mary. I chose Slender Man. I've experienced many paranormal things throughout my life, and this is a whole new level for me. So the reason I've mentioned the high school project is because it's relevant. There were 2 students which did Black-Eyed Children. This was cool when it came to presenting. I started to feel sick to my stomach, and I thought I'd caught a bug. I asked to go to the receptionist and ended up passing out on the way, and my mother took me to see a doctor. But the doctor just said it could be a viral infection. Anyway, go forward 2 weeks later. I was walking my dog, going through the woods, since there's a thin path that leads to a golf course surrounded by wooded hills. As I was walking through there with my dog, it suddenly started getting chilly and a bit windy, and a bit of gravel flew into my eye. When I realized there was someone on the path in a white dress covered in mud. It was a girl, and I noticed as I walked further that she had really pale skin. I was about 3 meters away when all of a sudden my dog cowered. I stopped and tried to calm him, but he wouldn't advance. The girl was facing the other way, and it wasn't until I actually went to tap her on the shoulder to see if she was alright that I realized she looked to be about 12. I hesitated as I went to tap her, and she turned her entire body round in one swift movement. She turned her head first, and did the same with the rest of her body, ending with her feet. "Are you okay?" That's when I noticed. Her eyes were black and looked more like marbles. Before I could finish talking, she asked, "Can I touch your dog?" It actually would have made me giggle if I wasn't so shaky. She was so direct with everything she said. "No," I replied. She went on to asking further questions. "Can I touch your hair?" With each of these, she eventually asked if she could hold my hand. It took me by surprise, and everything was no. She then began crying, talking about how she needed to hold my hand. I eventually started running away, and she tried crawling over to me and touching my dog. My dog at this point was wincing from fear. I looked behind me and saw the girl on the ground pulling at her hair, and then she was gone. I looked back a second time, and it was like she had literally sunk to the ground. I ran home, and I don't know what I experienced. but I no longer take my dog anywhere near that path. This story takes place during the summer, when I was 15. I was living with my dad and stepmother at the time. I remember my stepmother throwing a royal fit about buying me new school clothes because I had left a few pairs of pants get holes in them and still wore them. It was my first year going to high school, and I wasn't going to let her spoil that for me, so I went to stay with my grandparents for the summer to earn some money. They live in a remote, small area that was once home to many native tribes, most prominently the Quinault tribe. It's very secluded despite being only a mile or so from the highway, and it's all lush, gorgeous forest. My grandpa had built his own 3-story house and a shop where he cut and assembled cedar into roofing products. That's where I came in, hauling heavy chunks of cedar to his van, stacking, nailing, cinching up shake and shingle into bundles to be sold. I made good money while there and was able to buy an entire new wardrobe. As summer was coming to an end and it was too hot to work, I decided to take a walk one day. Now let me say I spent my childhood roaming these woods. Armed with my grandparents' 2 dogs, we ran and played and napped all day, and I've never seen anything out of the ordinary or gotten any weird vibes. I waited until it was a bit cooler in the evening and started out, walking a little path that would take me out to an old unused logging road. I had tread this same path so many times that I wasn't even paying attention until I felt that I was being watched. I would like to note here that I was young at the time. I had yet to touch drugs or alcohol and still have no history of hallucination or mental illness along those lines. What I saw still haunts me to this day. There he was, standing naked in the middle of my path, looking down at me with a blank expression. He was tall, maybe 7 feet, much taller than my 5 feet nothing. He had long, black, matted and grey hair, and there were tufts of it growing from the sides of his arms and legs as well. There were no genitals, only smooth flesh where they should be, and his skin, it was such a sickly pale yellow. It looked to be far too big for stature and hung in some spots. We made eye contact. His yellow orbs felt like they were staring into my soul. I couldn't move or think. Everything had gone silent around me. The next 10 seconds or so of my life seemed to stretch out. We just stood there looking at one another before he swiftly turned and walked back into the trees. The foliage went undisturbed as he melted through it and vanished. I honestly expected him to charge me or at least be intimidating, but he just turned and left. I haven't seen him since either, nor am I too enthusiastic to go out looking. I remember telling my grandma about it, but she told me it was probably just drug addicts in the area she lives in, as there are a high number of users and manufacturers of methamphetamine. I've told this story to others before, but I've never really gone out my way to share it, particularly because it sounds made up. I've tried looking in Native American folklore, especially the local stuff, but haven't found anything matching that description. If you actually have any idea on what this particular being might be, please let me know. I would love to find out. My house, which I rent, has a ground floor and 2 more floors, so 3 in total. I was getting ready to go out, and I went to the 1st floor, in my room to get my makeup. I went to the 2nd floor in my flatmate's room to do my makeup there. I go back to my room about 45 minutes later, and I see 3 of my purses on the floor, and the shoulder handle has been cut on 2 of them and a little bit on the 3rd one. Both purses are cut in the same way, in the same spots. I start freaking out a bit because no one was in the house except me and my flatmate, and we've been living together upstairs the whole time. In the living room, which is on the ground floor, we had left the back window open so the air could ventilate, and we had had some people over the night before. The door in the living room leads to a tiny garden which is protected by a tall fence, which is more protected by a wired fence, and I doubt anyone could have just climbed it and come in, cut purses, take no money or cards from either of them and then leave. The complex has 8 flats, so all the tiny gardens are connected in a long line, but we are only connected to one as we are the last flat in this line. So absolutely nothing was stolen or even moved, and we see no marks anywhere. But it's still weird, so I call the police to find an explanation. They come, checked the evidence. There was a wet spot on the carpet in a room about 5 centimeters long, and how the purses are cut. I thought it was a fox that went in the house, went upstairs, ate the bags and left, based on facts that a fox tried to enter the living room one time, in the same way a few weeks ago. The police said it was not an animal cut. It was most probably a knife cut, and asked if we had any problems with anyone like an ex or something. We do not. Most people do not even know where I live, and especially how to get to one's room, as the house is pretty complicated. The stairs in the house are metal and spiraled, and you basically hear it from every spot in the house if someone is on the stairs. Police call forensics to ask for advice, and they say they do not know what they could do as they can't take fingerprints off the bags because of the texture, and the wet spot is apparently dry now. Police say they've never heard of anything like it, and it makes no sense. They marked it off as a burglary and left. I have to mention that the night to morning before, we had the music pretty loud, and one neighbor texted us very angrily to stop it. I mean, he knows the house as we have the same structure. He was the only one with access, but he's like 75 years old, and all the encounters we had were really nice so far. So we were left with something or someone that comes to the house through the back garden that's protected by a very high wall and wide fence, comes through the living room, passes by the PS4, TV, expensive speakers, goes onto the hallway, passes very expensive shoes, goes up the stairs, enters a bedroom, cuts the handle to the purses, doesn't take anything and then just leaves. I slept in my flatmate's room that night, and today I went into my room to clean it up, and I found one of the missing handle pieces in my bed, under the blanket. What the hell is going on? I have no explanation for any of this, and simply wish I did. My family has always been pretty sensitive to the paranormal, only on my mother's side, but it did pass down to my brother and myself. The first story occurred when I was about 6 years old. I have a friend called Caitlin. We hung out almost every day. I live in a wooded area, and we have a brush pile of approximately 7 feet. Caitlin came over one day in the middle of winter, and we were sledding down the snowbanks in my driveway. We were about to go on our 3rd or 4th run to solidify the track, and Caitlin froze in her step. I jokingly asked her if she was tired already, and she smacked me and pointed to the brush pile. "Do you see that?" she asked me. I turned and saw a figure there. It stood a foot or so above the brush pile, making this thing about 8 feet tall. It was in the shape of a person, but a solid black mass. Needless to say, we both freaked out because it was just standing there. Then as we ran towards the house, it disappeared. Fast forward 8 years. I'd just turned 14 and we temporarily moved in with my grandparents. I was down in the basement doing some artwork for an assignment, and I felt like I was being watched. I turned around and I remember dropping my paint palette on the ground. There it was. This thing that I hadn't seen in so long was standing in front of me. I had no idea where it came from, and at this point had chalked the previous experience up to being a child with an overactive imagination. But here it was, standing in front of my face. I noped out of the basement as fast as I could and started seeing it more frequently every time I went to do the cat litter. which sadly was also in the basement. Every time I was down there painting, and even when I was at school, this thing would appear. I was convinced I was going mad. I ended up calling Caitlin and asked her if she remembered anything odd from when we were kids. She responded with something along the lines of, "Not really, besides the thing in the brush." Now I knew something weird was happening. She remembered the experience as vividly as I do, even though we hadn't spoken about it in almost a decade. I'd recently moved into my new house and figured that would be the end of it. But no. First night I was in the basement, the figure was back. I still see it to this day over 10 years later. I've no idea what it is. There's so much more to tell with this entity, including a near-death experience. I just wanted to put this out there, to see if anyone knew what it is. When I was 7, we had just moved into our house, after having lived in an apartment before that. I was beyond happy. We had a big backyard and about an acre of woods after that, perfect for a kid to run around and explore. Christmas Eve was held at our house, and we had a full house. It was incredibly cold, so all the kids were kept inside, which was fine because we had games and all of the glorious 70s TV Christmas specials. It was 11 p.m. when everyone had left, and I was in bed trying to fall asleep. But hey, good luck with that, kids. An hour later, everyone was asleep except for me, when I heard a faint crunching noise outside that I realized was getting louder. It was starting to freak me out, when a shadow appeared at my window. It was a bright moon that night, and reflected off the 4 to 6 inches of snow. I looked at it against all my instincts, and I swear, I saw a giant, humanoid figure with horns, like a massive dude almost filling the window. At that point, I don't know how else to describe what I felt, except for saying it was like an acceptance of pure dread and terror. Then the shadow seemingly evaporated. That's when I jumped out my bed screaming and ran to my parents' room. They were already up, having heard my screams. My dad grabbed his hunting rifle and ran outside. My mum and I looked outside from their window and we saw my dad yelling at the woods, gun raised. I saw a set of tracks that led right up to my bedroom window and just ended. My dad, who was a seasoned hunter, later told us the tracks just ended, and whoever it was didn't backtrack. I've never seen my dad scared before, nor ever again. He was a vet, and all around a fearless kind of guy. We never figured out what happened that night. It never happened again, thankfully. That's not the creepy part though. I had dreamt of this exact encounter for the previous 2 years down to my dad outside with his rifle. A few weeks ago, I was staying with my mum, grandfather and uncle in a small cottage in Cape Cod, probably built sometime in the late 60s. My mother and I were staying in a room with 2 twin beds about 6 feet apart on each side of a small room. We had driven there late, and everyone was settling down to go to bed around 3 a.m. The very first night that we were there, it was around 3:30, and the lights were off and my mum was already asleep. Now I 100% know that I was tired at this moment, but I was completely awake. I'm getting chills just thinking about it. I was laying on my side in the direction of the bed, facing my mother, and suddenly I blinked, and the next thing I know, a pitch-black shadowy figure with womanly features and long hair hanging down appeared in front of me, clear as day, and whispers, "Hey, shh." And for a short moment I thought it was my mum, but when I looked she was asleep and the figure was gone before I could react. I spent the next 2 hours freaking out, practically having an anxiety attack with my heart racing, trying to play off what I just saw. My mother doesn't believe in the supernatural, and says it was my imagination. But I am a college-age man, and know for a fact that I was completely awake when I saw and heard what I did. I felt incredibly uncomfortable in the room the next 3 nights, as we were there and slept facing the wall. I didn't even dare to flip over and face that wall again, and I swear I heard light footsteps the next few nights in that room, all aboard the Nope train. I grew up in the suburbs of Charlotte, North Carolina. My parents bought a house from the 70s complete with colourful toilets, pink and periwinkle, and lots of vibrant wallpaper. The house was not open concept in the slightest, with 4 doors to the outside, 2 staircases, and with many easy storage places and walls one could hide behind without someone in the next room having any idea where they were. The house has always creeped me out, even though we now have normal white toilets. One day my brother and I left for school and my dad left for work, leaving my mum alone to get ready for work. While in the kitchen, she heard the electric pencil sharpener going off upstairs, as if someone was sharpening a pencil, on and off repeatedly for several minutes. She hauled ass out the house and called the sheriff to investigate. The sheriff walked through the entire house, checking every little crevice behind every wall for signs of an intruder. When he got to the office, he noticed the storage closet that was never used was wide open, and there were the freshly sharpened pencils sitting on the desk. He couldn't explain what he saw, but it would be extremely easy for someone to slip in and out of one of the various entrances without anyone knowing. Things got even weirder when a few days later, my mum and I found another perfectly sharpened pencil in the passenger seat of her car. This all happened 11 years ago, and the weird pencil finding stopped there. But we are still convinced someone was stalking my mum, and we have dubbed this person the Pencil Man, and blame him whenever something goes missing, or isn't where it should be. I was driving home 2 days ago at about 3 a.m. I was driving on a British A road which is in the middle of nowhere and surrounded by forest. Now, I pretty much know this road like the back of my hand, as I've been driving it back and forth, mostly at night, for a long time. There are street lights, but they're quite dim and don't do a great deal of lighting up the road ahead. Now, as a bit of background, I'm generally a calm driver. I don't know why, as I'm quite frantic in real life, but when I'm behind the wheel, nothing seems to faze me at all. But the other night, I'm pretty sure I nearly had a heart attack. I was driving along the road as per usual on my way back home. The only way to describe this is to say that about 150 yards ahead of my car, out of the woods, this humanoid creature bolted into the road. It was a light grey colour and hunched over on all fours, but could easily be about 8 to 9 feet tall stood upright. This thing bolted into the road at an unnatural speed and disappeared into the woods on the other side of it. Now there's 4 lanes and no central reservation, so it was a straight sprint across. I tried to rationalize this as a bird, but I knew for a fact that it wasn't. Like I said before, I'm a very calm driver, but as soon as I saw this thing, I had instantly turned freezing cold and started sweating, almost on the verge of crying. I don't know what my rationalization was, but some part of me wanted to slam on my brakes out of panic, to take a breath, but I just put my foot down and drove way too fast to get away from what I saw. I don't necessarily know if it's relevant, but I remember looking at the clock, and it was dead on 3 a.m. Apparently this is the strange hour for unexplained things going on. If anyone else has had a similar experience or knows what this hell this thing was, I would love to hear about it, because even thinking about it gives me a cold chill. When I was a kid, probably between 8 and 10, I used to see shadow people in the night. It happened almost every single night. It was so frequent that I just got used to them. They never scared me. When I saw them, they would just walk against the wall and watch me while I was in bed. I remember they never had clothes, they were just a figure or body. They used to open my door at night, and I'm pretty sure one of them whispered my name into my ear at night, before bed, while I was brushing my teeth. I was in the washroom with my cousin and sister brushing our teeth before bed. They finished before me, and I was alone upstairs and I could feel something behind me but didn't acknowledge it until I heard a really faint whisper of someone saying my name right into my ear. All I remember is freaking out and running downstairs screaming that someone just said my name. There was also this one time I was playing hide and seek with 3 of my siblings, and after finding 2 of them, we were looking for my sister and toys started being flung from her room. Being kids, we laughed it off, went running into the room looking for her. There wasn't anyone there, and we ended up finding her hiding in the basement. I also remember I used to suffer from 2 different night terrors when we lived in that house. One of them I still can't explain to this day. I can only draw a picture, but it's hard for me to do because of how traumatizing it was. The other was a dream of me walking down the basement and finding a little girl curled up in a ball in a box crying. The strange thing about that second dream is that my younger brother had the exact same dream. He's 17, I'm 23, and we still agree that's some messed up stuff going on in the house. I live in the campo, as we call it. So I'm about 7 kilometers away from the nearest town, where we had people up here, and they said that we had 4 lines of energy crossing over our land, which explained the strange things I and my family have seen on our land. This is one of the 50 or more experiences. This one was very odd. I had to walk to the bus stop every morning, and when it became winter, it was completely dark when I had to get up. One night I was walking down my mountain road and I noticed something. It was tall, whatever it was, and stood in the middle of an empty field. At first I thought it must have been a blur or a bug that flew past me, but when I looked at it, it was still there. How I tell if I'm hallucinating? I will close my eyes for 10 seconds and think of a color. If when I open my eyes the hallucination has even a hint of that color, I ignore it. After checking, I realized it must be real and standing there. This is how I describe this thing. It was tall, pale, its head was white. It had long arms, but its body was black and it was at least 3 meters tall. Now I know what you're thinking. This is a troll or something, but it's similar to Slender Man. I never liked Slender Man. I was never scared of him, and at this point he'd been dead for years. So the fact that I was hallucinating about him didn't make any sense. I decided to ignore it. It can't be Slender Man, that's ridiculous. But it kept showing up day after day. Not every day, but 3 out of the 5 days for school. I told friends and family, and of course no one believed me that this creature was following me. It wasn't in the same place either. It vanished at day and would reappear at night. I thought that it could be a scarecrow, but there were no crops, a prank maybe? Until one day, I saw it behind a mass of trees, its head peeking over at this point, and I thought I'd gone insane. Or that it was a prank, but it moved. It moved, and that was my first thought. It now followed me physically. It would walk behind me almost every day. I wasn't allowed a phone at the time, and we didn't have cameras because we were quite poor, so I had no way of documenting it, so I came up with a plan. I was going to make someone else see it, but unfortunately that never happened. After one annoying morning, I decided I'd had enough of this, and turned and screamed at it. After shouting at the thing, it turned around and walked away. I thought I had told my subconscious to stop messing with me and it agreed. But later in life, I was proven wrong. My brother of 8 also saw the creature, and to be fair, I'm 99% sure he'd never even heard of Slender Man. He saw it looking through his window at night, and a year ago it stalked me again. I saw it wandering through the fog on a creepy day. Even my grandparents claimed to have seen it. So have my friends, as one day we had a sleepover at mine and one of my friends came running back in after going for a wee and saying something about he's seeing Slender Man. We all make fun of him for it, because I knew that that would be the nail in the coffin. You see, the friends that stayed over at my house that night were the only people I never told, as they didn't believe in anything remotely paranormal. One day while walking home, I heard a scream and the trees shake extremely violently in a nearby forest. At the time I thought it could have been a Bigfoot. I don't know why. We don't have mountain lions or anything like that could have roared that loudly or shaken the trees. I also heard 3 other stories in my town about 2 years back, about a large, slender creature eating someone's garbage, and them having witnessed it. I've heard nothing as of late, and there has been a lack of paranormal events. This happened some years ago. When I had the iPhone 4S, I was laying in bed when I received a phone call. I forget who exactly it was or what exactly they claimed to be offering, but it was very obviously a scam of some sort. Well, not obviously enough. This lady was asking me for various details of personal information, which I was giving for some reason. I believe I've read about how people are willing to give up all sorts of information as long as they are asked by someone with the illusion of power or something like that. I was readily handing out my name, email address, confirming my phone number, and it wasn't until she asked for my home address that my common sense kicked in. I didn't need this lady or anyone affiliated with her making house calls, or even so much as sending me garbage mail. "Why do you need my address?" I asked. "So I can process you," she replied. It sounded reasonable. It even made sense, assuming she was claiming to be doing whatever it was legitimately. But I no longer had the blind faith to hand out any information, in hopes that it was. My exact location was pretty much the last detail I was still hanging on to, and I had now decided not to relinquish it. Nothing too creepy had happened yet. Obviously, just politely I declined and hung up. Well, that was where I ran into trouble. Now she was literally using my name every time she said something to me. After I said nothing to her last statement, she repeats, "Can I have your address, please, Sakura?" I say nothing, take my phone away from my head and tap the end call button on screen, but nothing happens. The touch screen is now completely unresponsive. I am unable to end my call. I vaguely know how easy it would have been not too long previously had I kept my cool as hell Motorola Razr. Still not saying anything, I hold the lock button until the slide to power off option appears. Of course, my touchscreen is still unresponsive, so this was not a solution after all. Thinking back on it now, I could have just kept holding the lock screen button until the phone would have force powered off, but I guess I wasn't aware of that feature at the time. I had experienced this stupid unresponsive touchscreen issue before and during phone calls. This wasn't the first time I was unable to end phone calls on my own, but I knew that once the call was ended by the other person, the touchscreen functionality would return. But typically the person I'm talking to isn't completely intent on keeping me on there until I relinquish all my secrets. I continued to say nothing. Not only had I decided to not give up my address, but I wasn't even going to give away any more of my voice. So I lay the phone on my bed near me and buried my head in the pillow, waiting for her to give up and end the call. But she didn't. I could still hear her a short distance away. "Give me your address, Sakura." I ignored her and stayed laying there. "What is your address, Sakura?" I've been silent for a while now. Any normal person would have likely given up on the conversation, but not this she-witch. She still repeated her question, and I searched my brain for a solution. I found one. It's a fairly last resort. I take a trick from my experience jailbreaking my iDevice. I seize my phone, which is still transmitting, an attempt to ascertain my location, and hold the lock and home button until my phone is put in DFU mode. This essentially bricks it temporarily. I guess you put your phone in this mode when you are recovering your device, as well as for some jailbreaks. Finally, my link to this woman was severed. I brought my phone back from the DFU mode, and everything was fine after that. I wondered if she somehow had the ability to disable ending the phone call. I now figure it was just a coincidence that the unresponsive touchscreen glitch happened during the call. That's about it though. It was just a really creepy situation to be in, laying there in the dark, being unable to hang up on her, and her repeating the need for my address over and over. I never got another phone call about it, never so much as an email. Maybe it wasn't a scam and I missed the chance of a lifetime. However, judging by her willingness to talk to thin air for a few minutes, I doubt it. Due to the quarantine, my dad and I wanted to get out of the house and just get the bikes rolling for a few days. Last Thursday, we locked up the house, packed the saddlebags, fired up the bikes, him on a 58 Panhead and me on a Triumph Bonneville, and rode up the Blue Ridge Parkway to the Nantahala National Forest. Since all the state park campgrounds are closed, we set up the tents in a little private campground by the river in a fairly remote place. Railroad tracks cut a path through the woods, then stretched into the distance. We passed the nearest town hours ago. That night after the fire was embers and my dad had retired, I was sitting by myself texting some friends. My phone was running out of juice and I wanted to give my boyfriend a call before it died. So I walked to the other side of the clearing, staring into the darkness of the tree line. It was then that I began to feel a sense of unease, like I was being watched through the trees. I sat on a stump by the tracks and glanced down the rails, catching a dark silhouette against the starry night sky and the moon reflecting off the slick tracks. I squinted, thinking it was just the trees playing tricks on me. Then it moved. That's when the dread hit me, like when you're hiking through the woods and spot a grizzly bear ambling across the trail. It was a distinctly humanoid figure, with a thin torso and spindly limbs. No discernible facial features. It was about 30 yards away, crossing the tracks away from me. I stumbled back and fell on my ass. When I got back up, it was gone. I went back to the tents shortly after that, and didn't sleep at all. It may have been some sort of dream or hallucination or mirage, but I saw something. I was sleeping pretty tight, and I think it was something like 2 to 3 p.m. You know, when inside your house is totally dark, but not that pitch black darkness, more like a bluish darkness. Anyway, I was sleeping like a rock. Trust me, because I woke up all of a sudden without the sound waking me up, and the door of this room was open. I can clearly see the short corridor and part of the living room. And then I looked to the living room to see something tall, 100% black and wearing something like a coat, standing near my boyfriend's grandma's feet, and I was paralyzed. I stared at the entity for a minute or so, and it wasn't even bothered that I was looking. I looked to my boyfriend's bed, but he was asleep, and I wanted so badly to wake him up, but I was scared that if I moved, I would rouse the thing and it would approach me. Maybe if I stand up or stick my leg pretty close to his, I'll wake him, I thought. But I was afraid the entity would look my way. So I tried pressing my eyes together to see if it was a hallucination. But it didn't vanish. It was standing there like a real person. So after deciding that I couldn't do anything about it, I closed my eyes with my heart pounding on my chest and fell asleep. In the morning, I heard from my mother-in-law that his grandma wasn't feeling well and had to go to the hospital. I can't say how freaked out I was, but I didn't tell her because she's skeptic. But I told my boyfriend what happened, and from that day on I've always been afraid to wake up in the middle of the night. in case I see something I don't want to. I used to live in really rural Texas and was driving down a farmer's market road during some very thick fog. I was in an old pickup truck and was going maybe 20 to 30 miles an hour because I couldn't see very far ahead. As I came around a bend, I saw through the fog this big hulking figure lurching across the road. I slowed down, pulled up to pass it, when I saw it was the biggest hog I'd ever seen in my life. A 400-pound one, certainly. It was dead, presumably destroyed whichever car hit it, and dragging it to the side of the road was an absolutely massive white shaggy dog. This dog, I was in a pickup truck and it made eye contact with me. It lifted its head and stared at me, eye level, for what felt like an eternity. I stopped my truck and stared. I was so caught off guard. After a few seconds, it put its head back down, grabbed a chunk of hog and continued to make its way off the road. To break it down, the dog was smart enough to move that animal it wanted to eat, large and strong enough to drag a 400-ish pound hog across pavement, and tall enough to look at me in the eye in a pickup. I'll never forget those eyes. It had a mud-stained white fur coat, a big block head and a long wolfy tail. It almost looked like a Pyrenees, but with a big St. Bernard-shaped head and double the normal size with glowing yellow eyes. I have no idea if it was some sort of freak farm dog, a spirit or wolf or whatever, but I would never want to see it again. Me and my sister went on a road trip a few months ago, and we had recently heard about black-eyed children, and we read stories about them for hours. The next day, I was with a few of my friends. We drove down an alley to get to a parking garage. Standing in the center of the alley was an old lady with white hair, wearing an old-fashioned white dress. Even from a distance, I could see she was staring at me. As we got closer, I noticed her eyes were completely black. I started shaking and didn't really believe what I was seeing. I really thought that I was fabricating it in my mind because of having read about it just the night before. So I asked my friend in a shaky voice, "Does that lady have black eyes?" Holy crap, dude. His voice instantly became shaky, and we turned around and went in another entrance to the parking garage. When we walked by the alley again a minute later, she was standing in the same spot. Every moment she was in sight, she was staring into my eyes. It was incredibly upsetting. I'm glad I didn't have to talk to her. She appeared to be 70 years or older. Could it have been a black-eyed senior citizen? Really chilling experience.